I don't take orders from a woman who files paperwork. Lieutenant Kessler let the words drop like he was spitting on the floor of the supply office, and every soldier behind him grinned because grinning was easier than thinking. You see a rifle in her hands. No, you see a clipboard. So sit down, sweetheart, and let the men handle the mountain. Rachel Carter didn't blink. She just watched him walk out, laughing, all of them laughing. And she already knew which ones would be screaming by tomorrow night. If you're watching this, do me a favor. Subscribe to the channel. Stay with this story all the way to the end and comment the city you're watching from right now so I can see how far this story travels. Let's begin. Rachel Carter had learned a long time ago that silence was its own kind of weapon. Most people never figured that out. They thought silence meant weakness, meant surrender, meant a person had nothing left to say. But Rachel knew better. Silence was where you kept the truth until the exact moment it could do the most damage. So when Kessler laughed at her, when the whole platoon laughed at her, she said nothing. She just wrote the shipment numbers on her tablet, checked the crate seals, and let them think whatever they wanted to think. The morning had started ordinary enough. 6 trucks rolling into the staging yard, a fresh infantry platoon detached for joint field training, and Rachel there to do what she always did, which was make sure that when men went into the field, the equipment they carried that actually worked. She had been the logistics contractor at the Blackthorn training range for 11 months. 11 months of counting rounds, tracking radios, logging vehicle maintenance, and being invisible. That was fine with her. Invisible was safe. Invisible didn't ask questions about the past. Ma'am, you got the ammunition manifest. The kid asking couldn't have been more than 19. His name tape said Doyle. He had the kind of face that hadn't been tested yet, hopeful and eager, and completely unaware of how quickly the world could take that away. Right here, Rachel said, handing him the tablet. But before you sign it, look at line 7. Doyle glanced down. The batteries. That lot number's on a recall. They lose 40% charge in cold conditions, and you're going up into elevation where it drops below freezing after dark. Your radios die at the worst possible time. Doyle frowned confused because nobody had told him a civilian was supposed to know things like that. I should probably run that up to the lieutenant. You should, Rachel agreed. He did. She watched him cross the yard to where Kessler stood with his sergeants, watched the way Kessler's head tilted when Doyle explained watch the sneer form before the boy even finished talking. Kessler didn't come to her. He didn't need to. He just raised his voice loud enough that the whole yard could hear. Doyle, are you seriously telling me the paperwork lady thinks she knows more about our comms than the United States Army? The laughter again. Rachel kept her eyes on the crate in front of her. Doyle came back, ears red. He says the batteries are fine, ma'am. I heard what he said. She made a note on her tablet, a small one-time stamped. Sign the manifest, Doyle, but do me one favor. When you pack out tomorrow, throw 2 extra battery packs in your ruck. Keep them close to your body so your body heat keeps them warm. Don't tell anybody. Just do it. He looked at her for a long second. Why are you telling me this if the lieutenant says it's fine? Because I don't want to read your name in a report, Rachel said. That shut him up. He signed, and he did later throw 2 battery packs in his ruck. That decision would matter more than either of them could have known. By midday, the platoon had settled into the barracks buildings on the north end of the range, and the mood had turned into the kind of loose confidence that comes from young men who think they have already won something. Rachel heard them through the thin walls. She heard her name. She heard the word civilian used the way you'd use a slur. She heard Sergeant Vance, a broad-shouldered man with a voice like gravel, telling a story about how contractors were the people who couldn't hack the real thing, the ones who washed out and came crawling back to hang around the edges of a uniform they weren't allowed to wear anymore. He wasn't entirely wrong. That was the part that stung. Rachel had crawled back to the edges of something. She just wasn't going to explain why. She finished her inventory and instead of going to the mess hall, she took her clipboard, her real one, the metal one, and she walked the perimeter of the training zone the way she did every day. It wasn't in her contract. Nobody paid her to do it, but she had spent enough years reading terrain to know that a range map drawn 6 years ago wasn't the same as the ground under your boots today. And the ground under her boots today was telling her a story she didn't like. She was crouched near the eastern approach, examining a fracture line in the rock where the last spring's runoff had eaten out the base of a slope when a voice behind her said, "Lost, ma'am." She stood without hurrying. It was Vance, the sergeant, with the gravel voice arms crossed, watching her, the way a man watches something he's already decided is beneath him. Just looking, Rachel said. Uh-huh. You know this is a restricted training area, right? Not a nature walk. I know exactly what it is. She pointed at the fracture line. This slope's undercut. You put a squad on top of it during a live exercise, add the vibration from movement and any explosive simulators, and you've got a collapse risk. Your platoon's operations plan routes second squad right across the top of it tomorrow at 0900. Vance's jaw worked. And how would you know our ops plan? Because I process the range reservation and the movement schedule. It's my job to know where you're going, so I know where to put the water and the ammunition. She said it flat, no heat in it. I'm telling you, the ground's not stable. Reroute the squad 200 meters east, and you avoid the whole problem. For a moment, just a moment, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not agreement, but maybe the first faint recognition that she wasn't talking like a paperwork lady. Then it closed off because admitting it would mean admitting he'd almost been schooled by a civilian, and men like Vance would rather die than admit that. I'll take it under advisement, he said in the tone that meant he wouldn't. Sergeant. She stopped him as he turned. I'm not trying to embarrass you. I don't care about that. I care about your people coming home, that's all. He looked back at her, and this time the flicker lasted a second longer, but he still walked away. Rachel stood there a while after he was gone. She thought about how many times she had watched a man choose his pride over his people, and how it never once ended the way he thought it would. That evening, she did something she almost never did. She went to the range office where the duty officer sat a captain named Reyes, who at least had the decency to look tired instead of arrogant, and she asked to see the latest intelligence advisory for the region. Reyes raised an eyebrow. That's classified, Carter. You know that. I'm not asking to read the classified part. I'm asking whether there's been any updated advisory about unauthorized activity in the canyon sector. Movement. Anything. Reyes leaned back. Why would you ask that? Because 3 weeks ago, a rancher 40 miles south reported a stolen fuel truck, and nobody ever recovered it. Because 2 weeks ago, a hunting party found spent brass in a draw that isn't part of any training footprint, wrong caliber for anything we run. Because last week, the range cameras on the west perimeter went dark for 6 hours, and maintenance chalked it up to a power fault. But I checked the log, and there was no power fault anywhere else in the grid. She let that sit. I file the maintenance reports, Captain. I read all of them. Somebody's been watching this range, and I don't think it's kids. Reyes was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had lost its lightness. Have you told anyone else this? I tried to tell Lieutenant Kessler this morning. He told me to sit down, sweetheart. Something crossed Reyes's face, something like embarrassment, on behalf of the whole institution. I'll look into it, he said, and she could tell he meant it. But she could also tell that a captain looking into it and a captain acting on it were two different animals, and the machine moved slow, and tomorrow the platoon was going into the canyon at first light no matter what anybody wrote in a report tonight. Thank you, Rachel said, and she meant it too because it was more than anyone else had given her. She didn't sleep much. She lay on the cot in her small quarters, and she listened to the wind, and she ran the numbers in her head the way she always did, the way she couldn't stop doing even after all these years. Approach vectors, fields of fire, where she would set up if she wanted to trap a platoon in that canyon. The answer came to her easily, too easily, because a good position for an ambush is a good position for an ambush no matter which side of the rifle you're on. And Rachel had spent a long time on the wrong end of that math learning exactly how it worked. By the time the sky started to gray, she was already up. She was in the supply office before the platoon had finished formation, and she watched them through the window as they loaded out. She watched Kessler stride up and down the line like he was the star of a movie only he could see. She watched Vance run the equipment check, and she noticed with a small private satisfaction that Vance had quietly rerouted second squad 200 meters east. He hadn't announced it. He hadn't credited her. But he'd done it. That told her something about the man. There was something underneath the pride that could still be reached if it survived long enough to be worth reaching. And she watched young Doyle ruck heavy on his shoulders, and she saw the 2 extra battery packs bulging in the side pocket where he'd wedged them close against his kidneys, and she felt the smallest loosening in her chest. They rolled out at 0640. The trucks disappeared up the access road toward the canyon sector, engines fading, And then the range was quiet again in that particular way it got when all the young men had gone off to play at war. Rachel went back to her inventory. She counted crates. She logged serial numbers. She told herself it was somebody else's job to worry now that she had done what she could, that she had warned them, and they had laughed, and that was on them. She almost believed it. At 0900, she was standing at the coffee urn in the range office when Captain Reyes came out of the operations room too fast and she knew the way. You know a thing in your stomach before your brain has caught up that something had gone wrong. Carter, he said, that advisor you asked about. I made some calls last night. He was holding a printout and his hand wasn't quite steady. There's a paramilitary cell that's been operating out of the Bitterroot corridor. Federal task force has been tracking them for 2 months. They've been probing military installations, testing response times, looking for a soft target. Rachel set down her coffee. Where are your soldiers right now, Captain, the Canyon sector? Which is the softest target within 100 miles filled this morning, with a platoon of green infantry running blank fire training with recalled batteries and a lieutenant who thinks the ground bends to his ego. She was already moving toward the map board. When did you last have comms with them? Reyes checked his watch. Scheduled check-in was 0845. They missed it. How long do you wait before that's a problem? 15 minutes. Standard for terrain that bad. His voice tightened. That was 7 minutes ago. Rachel stared at the map at the canyon drawn in faded contour lines, and everything she had run through her head in the dark last night lit up like a diagram she'd already memorized. The narrow valley floor, the 2 ridges rising on either side, the single choke point at the north end that was the only clean extraction route, the one place a smart enemy would seal first. They've lost comms because someone's jamming them, or the batteries died in the cold, and either way the result's the same, she said. If it's the militia, they waited for the platoon to get all the way into the valley before they closed the door. Textbook. You don't spring the trap at the mouth, you spring it when everyone's committed. She turned to Reyes. How fast can you get a QRF up there? Quick reaction force. Anybody. Air. Nearest aviation asset is at Malmstrom. That's a 90-minute spin-up minimum plus flight time. Reyes was pale now. Ground Quick Reaction Force is a support company 40 minutes out on the road, and the road's the choke point. So best case, the fastest help those kids get is more than an hour away. Rachel's voice had gone very quiet and very calm, which was a thing that happened to her when the world got dangerous, and old wiring she'd never been able to burn out. And if this is what I think it is, they don't have an hour. The radio on the console crackled. A voice broke through, ragged, half swallowed by static. Any station, this is Blackthorn 2-6. We are taking effective fire. I say again, effective fire. We have wounded. We are pinned in the valley and we cannot locate the shooters, requesting immediate. The transmission dissolved into a wash of noise. Underneath it, for half a second, Rachel heard the unmistakable flat crack of rifle fire. The real kind. The kind that had nothing to do with blanks. Reyes lunged for the handset. Blackthorn 2-6. This is range control. Say your status, over. Nothing but static. Blackthorn 2-6, do you copy, over? Static. He tried 3 more times. Each time the silence got heavier. Rachel watched him, and she felt the old thing rising in her, the thing she'd spent 3 years trying to bury under crates and clipboards and invisibility. It wasn't fear. She wished it were fear, because fear you could reason with. It was worse. It was the cold certainty of exactly what she needed to do and exactly how much it was going to cost her to do it. Captain, she said, I need you to listen to me now because we don't have time for you to not believe me. Reyes turned, still gripping the dead handset. 3 years ago, I wasn't a logistics contractor, Rachel said. I was a scout sniper. I did 4 combat deployments. Before that, I was selected for a counter-sniper unit whose name I'm not cleared to say in this room. I know how to read that canyon because reading canyons like that was my entire life. And right now, I am the only person within 60 miles who can do anything about what's happening to your soldiers. For a long moment, Reyes just looked at her, and she watched him try to fit the woman with the clipboard into the words she just said, and she watched the 2 images finally lock together in his head. The emergency armory, Rachel said. Building 9. There's a designated marksman rifle in the ready locker, an M110 with an optic, and there's ammunition. I need you to authorize me to draw it, and I need a vehicle. and I need both in the next 90 seconds. Carter, I can't just hand a civilian a, you can. There's a provision, emergency arming of qualified personnel during an imminent threat to life. It's in the range regulations. I know because I filed the regulations. Captain, I processed every one of them. She stepped closer. Your soldiers are dying in that valley right now. The men who laughed at me yesterday are bleeding out because they didn't listen. You can process the paperwork after, but if you make me wait for a phone call up the chain, they will all be dead before anyone with a rank higher than yours picks up. The radio crackled again. This time it was a different voice, younger, cracking with panic. Range control, this is Doyle. Private Doyle, I switched to my backup battery. Our lieutenant is hit. Sergeant Vance is trying to hold us together, but they got us from both ridges. We can't move, please. Is anybody coming? Is anybody? Rachel didn't wait for Reyes to answer. She keyed nothing. She said nothing. She just looked at the captain, and everything she needed to say was in her face. Reyes made his decision. Building 9's already unlocked for the exercise. Take the gray pickup keys are in it. He was already reaching for the phone to start burning up the chain of command behind her. Carter, what am I supposed to tell them you are? Rachel was halfway to the door. She paused just for a second. Tell them I'm just a civilian, she said. And then she was gone. The armory smelled like oil and old metal, the way they always did. Rachel moved through it without thinking, her hands remembering things her mind had tried to make her forget. The M11 came out of the ready locker, heavier than she remembered, or maybe she was just older, but the weight settled against her shoulder like an argument she'd been having with herself for 3 years finally ending. She checked the optic, she checked the action, she loaded the magazines with fast, economical movements. 20 rounds, 40 rounds, 60, filling every pocket she had, and the whole time a voice in the back of her head that sounded a lot like the shrink they'd made her see after the discharge kept saying, you don't have to do this. You don't owe them anything. They laughed at you, and Rachel kept loading because that voice had never understood the first thing about her. It wasn't about what they owed her. She threw the rifle across the bench seat of the gray pickup, and she drove hard up the access road toward the canyon, and the closer she got, the more she could hear it, that flat, rolling crackle rising up over the engine. Gunfire, real gunfire, the sound of the world tearing. Behind her, the range office phones were ringing. Reyes was on the line to a colonel who was on the line to a general, and words like unauthorized and civilian and liability were bouncing up a chain of command that had no idea a woman they'd never heard of was already 3 miles up a dirt road with a rifle and a reason. Rachel stopped the truck where the road narrowed, where a smart person on foot would go the rest of the way, and she went the rest of the way on foot. She moved up along the eastern edge, the high ground staying low, staying in the dead space where the ridgelines blocked line of sight, and every step of it came back to her, the way your body remembers a language you swore you'd stop speaking. She reached a shelf of rock near the shoulder of the ridge, and she went flat, and for the first time she looked down into the valley where the platoon was dying. She didn't let herself feel it. That would come later if she survived to have a later. Right now, she just read the ground the way she'd read it 1,000 times before. 2 soldiers down in the open, one moving, one not. A cluster of men jammed against the base of the west wall, using a shallow fold in the rock for cover, and she recognized Vance among them by the way he was moving, dragging a wounded man by his drag handle with one arm, while he fired uphill with the other, refusing to break, refusing to fold, and something in Rachel's chest twisted at the raw, stubborn courage of it. And there was Doyle pressed beside him, the radio to his mouth, still calling, still believing someone would answer. Then she looked at the ridges and she found what she was looking for, and her breathing slowed all the way down to nothing. 3 positions. She marked them one by one the way you'd mark words on a page. One on the west ridge, high in a notch of rock muzzle, flash, winking every few seconds, disciplined, patient, an experienced shooter working the pinned soldiers over methodically. A second lower on the same ridge, more aggressive, hammering rounds down into the fold where Vance's people were huddled, trying to break their cover. And a third, the one that mattered most, positioned on the east ridge with a clean angle on the north choke point, the extraction route, the door. That was the shooter sealing them in. That was the one keeping anyone from leaving. That was the one she'd have chosen herself. 3 shooters, one of her. A valley full of young men who thought she filed paperwork. Rachel Carter settled the rifle into her shoulder, pressed her cheek to the stock, and let the whole rest of the world fall away until there was nothing left but the reticle and her own slow heartbeat, and the shooter on the East Ridge, who had no idea, none at all, that he had exactly one breath left to live. She let out half her air, and she took the shot that would tell every man in that valley just how wrong they had been about the woman they called a civilian. The shot broke clean, and the shooter on the East Ridge stopped being a threat before the sound of it finished rolling down into the valley. Rachel didn't watch him fall. She was already moving in her eye, already shifting her weight, already hunting for the next one, because a single kill meant nothing if you gave the other two time to figure out where it came from. She had learned that a long time ago in a place she never talked about. One shot buys you seconds. What you do with those seconds is the whole difference between a soldier and a corpse. Down in the fold of a rock, Sergeant Vance felt the change before he understood it. He'd had a round chewing at the lip of stone 6 inches from his face for the last 90 seconds, so steady he could have set a watch by it, and then all at once, it stopped. The pressure from the east side of the valley just lifted like a hand had been taken off the back of his neck. "Why'd he quit?" Doyle shouted beside him, still clutching the radio. "Sergeant, why'd he stop shooting?" "He didn't quit," Vance said, breathing hard, dragging the wounded man tighter into cover. "Somebody made him stop. He didn't know who. He couldn't have guessed. But for the first time since the first round had snapped past his ear 11 minutes ago, Vance felt something he'd almost forgotten existed in this valley. He felt like maybe they weren't alone. Up on the ridge, Rachel found the second shooter, the aggressive one hammering the west wall, and she read him the way she read everything fast and complete. He was good, but he was hot, firing too much, giving away his position with every muzzle flash, a man who thought volume was the same thing as skill. She adjusted for the drop, for the thin, cold mountain air that would let the round fly a hair flatter than sea level for the crosswind, pushing left to right down the length of the valley. All of it happened in under 2 seconds in a part of her mind that had never stopped running these numbers even during 3 years of counting crates. She fired. The second shooter's rifle went silent mid-burst the way a song stops when you rip the needle off the record. "That's two," Rachel breathed to no one. Now they'd know. Now the last man, the disciplined one in the notch of rock on the West Ridge, would understand that his overwatch had been cut in half in the space of 15 seconds, and a disciplined man doesn't panic. A disciplined man goes still and starts thinking and starts looking for the shooter who's killing his friends. That made him the most dangerous of the three, and Rachel knew it. And she also knew she'd just given away her general direction with 2 shots from the same shelf of rock. She rolled left off the shelf into a shallow seam in the stone, and she'd barely settled before a round cracked into the exact spot where her rifle had been spitting rock chips into the air, where her cheek had rested a heartbeat earlier. "There you are," she said softly, not scared, almost grateful. A real one. Finally, a real one. Down below, the sudden second silence changed everything. The soldiers pinned against the west wall felt the enemy fire drop from a downpour to a trickle, and Vance seized the moment with both hands. "Move, move, get Harker out of the open," he roared. Second team lay down, suppression on that west ridge up high in the rocks. "I don't care if you can't see him. Make it keep his head down. Doyle, get me range control. Tell them fire's slackening. Tell them we've got somebody friendly on that ridge." "I'm trying." "Sergeant, I keep losing the signal." Doyle mashed the transmit button, pressing the warm backup battery against his chest like it was the only thing keeping him alive. And maybe it was. Range control, this is Doyle Blackthorne. 2-6 enemy fire is reducing, I say again, reducing. We think we have friendly fire support on the eastern high ground. Who do you have on that ridge? Who is that over? In the range office, Captain Reyes stood frozen with the handset against his ear, and beside him a colonel's voice was crackling out of the desk phone, demanding to know who had authorized a civilian to draw a weapon, and Reyes made a choice about which conversation mattered. "Blackthorne 2-6, this is range control," Reyes said into the handset, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. "The friendly on the ridge is ours. She's ours. Do not, I say again, do not fire on the eastern high ground. Keep your people down and let her work. Help is inbound over." Doyle turned to Vance with his eyes huge. "Sergeant, range control says it's a she." Vance was in the middle of hauling the wounded man's arm across his shoulders, and he stopped for exactly 1 second, and something moved across his face, some flicker of an idea too big to hold on to in the middle of a firefight. A she. On the ridge. With a rifle. Killing the men who were killing them. He didn't have time to finish the thought. A round from the last shooter cracked into the rock beside them, and he shoved it away and got back to the work of surviving. Up on the ridge, Rachel was doing math with her life as the variable. The last shooter had her general area. He'd fired once at her old position and missed by 3 feet, which meant he was estimating, not confirming. He didn't have her exact spot yet, but he would. He was patient and he was good. Patient, good shooters win the waiting game because all they have to do is watch one square of ground and put a round through the first thing that moves in it. She couldn't wait. Waiting was his game. So Rachel did the thing that had gotten her a reputation once in another life. She broke the rule. She moved during daylight across open rock toward the enemy closing the distance instead of holding her ground, because the one thing a patient shooter never expects is for his prey to walk straight at him. She crawled 30 meters along the seam low and fast, feeling the cold stone through her clothes, and when the seam ran out, she went up and over a hump of rock in a single fluid motion that lasted less than a second and a half, and she was flat again on the far side before he could have registered the movement. She was closer now. Closer meant a flatter shot, less wind, less drop, less guesswork. Closer also meant that if he found her, he wouldn't miss. She lifted her head a bare inch and glassed the notch where he'd been. Empty. He'd moved too. Of course he had. He was as good as she'd feared. Then she saw it. Not him, but the thing he'd forgotten to hide. A boot. Just the toe of one boot sticking half an inch past the edge of a boulder, 40 meters up and to her left, where he'd repositioned to get a better angle on her old spot. He'd covered everything else. His body, his rifle, his head. But he'd drawn his knee up to steady himself, and the toe of his boot had strayed out past cover, and he didn't know it. Rachel had a decision to make, and she made it in the time it takes to blink. A shot to the boot would wound him, would give her his exact position, but a wounded man behind cover was still a man with a rifle. She'd be trading her only advantage, surprise for a target she then had to finish, while he knew right where she was. Instead, she waited. 3 seconds. 4. She watched that boot, and she watched the edge of the boulder above it, and she thought about the geometry of a man's body when he's kneeling to shoot where his head has to be relative to his foot. She built a model of him in her mind out of that 1 square inch of boot leather. And when she had it, when she was sure, she shifted her aim 11 inches up and to the right of that boot to a spot of empty rock where nothing was showing at all. And she took up the slack on the trigger, and she said very quietly to a man she would never meet, "You should have stayed home." He leaned out to shoot. His head crossed into the exact space she'd already aimed at. She fired, and the third shooter died. In the same instant, he decided to take his shot, and the valley went silent. For a moment, Rachel didn't move. She lay against the cold rock and she listened, and there was nothing. No return fire, no muzzle flashes, no flat rolling crack, just the wind and her own heart, and drifting up, faint from the valley floor, the sound of young men realizing they were still alive. But Rachel didn't believe in silence. Silence was a weapon. She'd said so herself. And a good ambush is never just 3 men. 3 men were the trap. Somewhere there was a 4th element, the ones who spring forward when the shooting pins the prey, the assaulters who close in to finish the job while the overwatch holds everyone in place. She'd taken out the overwatch. That would make the assault element hesitate. It would not make them go away. She keyed nothing and shouted nothing to the men below. She just kept scanning methodically the whole valley floor and both ridgelines, hunting for the movement that would tell her where the rest of them were. Down below, Doyle was screaming into the radio again, and this time there was joy in it, ragged and disbelieving. "Range control, they stopped. The fire stopped. All 3 positions are down. I think we're clear." "We are not clear." Vance's voice cut through him like a blade. He'd been in enough real fights to know the difference between an enemy who's dead and an enemy who's waiting. "Everybody stay in cover. Nobody moves into the open. Check the wounded, redistribute ammo, and watch the north end. If they're coming from the north. That's the only way in that isn't a cliff." He was right. And up on the ridge, Rachel had just found them. 4 men, moving up the valley from the north, from the choke point, hugging the west wall, using the folds of rock the way she'd have used them. They'd been waiting for the overwatch to break the platoon. When the overwatch went silent, they'd assumed it was because the job was done, that their shooters had killed enough soldiers to make the assault a mop-up. They didn't know their overwatch was dead. They were walking into the valley thinking they had already won. Rachel counted them again. 4. She had maybe 40 rounds left across her magazines. The angle was bad. They were tight against the west wall, and she was on the east ridge, so she'd be shooting across the whole width of the valley at moving men who would go to ground the instant she fired. And the second she engaged, she'd give away her position to a fresh element who, unlike the Overwatch, could maneuver on her. She had one good volley before it became a fight she might not win. She keyed her mind through it fast. If she could drop 2 on the first 2 shots before they understood what was happening, the last 2 would either break and run or press the attack. If they ran, the platoon lived. If they pressed, she'd be alone on a ridge against 2 trained men who now knew exactly where she was. She thought about this drag handle in Vance's fist. She thought about Doyle's warm battery. She thought about the boot leather and the 11 inches. She thought for 1/2 of 1 second about a canyon in another country and a command that had told her to stand down while people died, and how she had not stood down then either, and what it had cost her. Then she stopped thinking and she went to work. She took the trail man first because dropping the trail man doesn't alert the front of the file for a critical half second. He folded. She was already on the 3rd man before the trail man hit the ground, and she took him too clean, and now the front 2 understood, and they went flat against the base of the west wall exactly where she'd known they would. 2 down, 2 to go, and now they knew. Contact East Ridge, one of them screamed in accented English, and both of them opened up, spraying rounds up at her position. Discipline bursts and rock chips exploded around Rachel's head and shoulders, and she pressed herself into the stone and felt 1 round pass so close it plucked at the fabric on her upper arm. She rolled. She came up 8 feet to the right and put 2 rounds into the base of the west wall, where she'd last seen them, not aiming to hit, but aiming to keep their heads down to buy the platoon time. Vance, she roared, and it was the first word she'd shouted since she reached the ridge, and it echoed off both walls. 2 hostiles at the base of the west wall, 90 meters north of your position. They're on your side now. They're coming up the wall toward you. I can't get a clean angle. They're too tight against the rock. Down below, Vance's head snapped toward the sound of the woman's voice and then toward the north. And he did the thing that separated him from Kessler, the thing that had probably kept his people alive for the last 12 minutes. He didn't argue. He didn't demand to know who she was. He acted. Ramirez Kowalski, the rest of you keep watching those ridges in case there's more. He was already moving low and fast along the base of his own wall, 3 soldiers behind him, closing on the 2 hostiles, pinned against the opposite wall from an angle Rachel couldn't reach. Doyle, stay with the wounded. Do not move, Harker, Sergeant. Don't stay with the wounded. That's an order. And Vance took his 3 men north along the valley floor to do the thing that couldn't be done from a ridge. And up above him, Rachel understood exactly what he was doing, and she understood exactly how to help. Vance, when you're set, I'll flush them, she called down. I'll put rounds on the north side of their cover drive. Them south, drive them right into you. On your call. Understood, Vance shouted back. And there was something in his voice now that hadn't been there when he'd told her she was on a nature walk. Trust. Raw and immediate, and born of the fact that this stranger on the ridge was the only reason he was still breathing. Give me 20 seconds. Rachel counted them in her head. 19, 18. She kept her reticle floating just north of the boulder the 2 hostiles were sheltering behind. 17. Down below, she could see Vance and his 3 soldiers flowing into position, silent, using the cover, and she felt a flush of something like respect for men she'd watched laugh at her yesterday. 12. 11. One of the hostiles risked a look around the north edge of the boulder trying to spot her, and she almost took him. And she didn't, because if she took him now, the other one might bolt north and the whole plan died. 8. 7. Set Vance's voice. Flushing now, Rachel said, and she poured 4 rounds into the north side of the boulder, walking them right along the edge of the hostiles' cover, close enough to feel like the hand of God slapping the rock beside their faces, and both men did exactly what men do when death is chewing at them from one direction. They ran the other way. South, straight into Vance and 3 soldiers who were waiting for them with their rifles up. It was over in 3 seconds. And then for real, this time the valley was silent. Rachel stayed on her rifle for a full 30 seconds after the last shot, scanning hunting, refusing to believe it until her eyes had confirmed it a dozen times over. 2 Overwatch on the west ridge dead, 1 on the east dead, 4 assaulters on the valley floor dead or down. 7. She'd counted 7. Her instinct said that was the whole element, a reinforced ambush team, the kind of force you'd send to hit a soft target and be gone before help arrived. But instinct wasn't proof, so she kept scanning even as her hands started to shake. The adrenaline finally finding the cracks in her the way it always did after never during. Down below, the platoon began slowly to understand that they had survived. Clear Vance was calling. "Sound off, give me a count who's hit." The answers came ragged and shaking. Harker gut wound alive, Doyle keeping pressure on it. Lieutenant Kessler hit high in the shoulder alive, pale and shock useless. Two more with fragmentation wounds walking. Everyone else by some miracle whole. 11 minutes of hell and they'd lost no one, and every man in that valley knew without anyone saying it that the reason they'd lost no one was up on the East Ridge with a rifle. Vance stood in the middle of the valley floor, chest heaving, and he turned toward the eastern high ground, and he cupped his hands around his mouth. "Whoever you are up there," he shouted, "identify yourself. Range control says you're friendly, so show yourself. Let me see you." For a moment, nothing happened. Then Rachel Carter stood up on the ridge, the M110 slung across her body, and she started down toward them, picking her way through the rock with the unhurried competence of someone who had done this 100 times in 100 worse places. And as she came down into the light where they could see her, one by one, the soldiers of Blackthorn 2-6 went still. Doyle recognized her first. His mouth fell open. "That's Sergeant. That's the paperwork lady. That's the logistics contractor. Oh my God, that's Ms. Carter." Vance didn't say anything. He just watched her come, this woman he'd found crouching at a fracture line yesterday, this woman he'd called lost, this woman he'd told was on a nature walk in a restricted zone. And he felt something turn over in his chest that felt a lot like shame and a lot like awe, and he didn't have a name for the mix of the two. Rachel reached the valley floor. She walked past the first hostile body without looking at it. She walked up to Vance and she looked at the wounded man Doyle was working on, and she dropped to a knee beside them. "Gut wound?" she asked, and her voice was completely level, completely calm, the voice of someone for whom this was not the exception, but a language she'd spoken for years. "Yes, ma'am," Doyle said, his hands slick and red. "I've got pressure on it, but he's losing a lot." "You're doing it right. Keep the pressure. Don't lift to look. Looking doesn't help him. Pressure helps him." She glanced at the wound with a practiced eye. "It's not arterial. He's got time if we get him out. What's your extraction status?" Sergeant Vance found his voice. "Air's inbound. Malmstrom launched a bird when range control got our first mayday. ETA's, hell, I don't know, 20 minutes, maybe less. Then we hold this ground for 20 minutes. And we don't get sloppy in the last 5, because the last 5 is where people die after they think it's over." She looked up at him, and there was no triumph in her face. No, "I told you so," nothing but the flat focus of a professional finishing a job. "Get your walking wounded consolidated. Get a security perimeter facing north, because north's the threat axis, and pick a casualty collection point that isn't in the open. You've got a good instinct. You kept these people alive for 11 minutes under fire with a green platoon. So use it for 20 more minutes and then you can fall apart like the rest of us, but not yet." Vance stared at her, then slowly something in him settled into place and he nodded once and turned and started giving the orders she'd laid out, and his men jumped to them, and the loose panicked cluster of survivors began under his voice to become a unit again. And that was the moment Lieutenant Kessler decided to speak. He was propped against the west wall, one hand pressed to his bloody shoulder, and the shock was wearing off just enough to let his personality come crawling back. And his personality, even now, even here, could not stand the sight of a woman giving orders his sergeant was following. "Who authorized this?" Kessler said, and his voice was thin, but it carried. "Who authorized a civilian to bring a weapon into an active? This is a court-martial. This is Vance. Why are you taking orders from her? She doesn't have any lieutenant." Vance didn't even turn around. "With respect, sir." "Shut up." The valley went very quiet. Kessler's mouth worked. "What did you say to me, Sergeant?" Vance turned around then, and when he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, and that made it worse. "I said, shut up, sir. That woman just killed 7 armed men who were about to overrun this position and kill every single one of us, including you. She did it alone. She did it with a rifle you laughed at her for knowing how to use. So you can lie there and think about your court-martial. Or you can lie there and be grateful you're alive to have this stupid conversation. But either way, you're going to do it quietly because I've got wounded to move, and I don't have time for your pride." Kessler didn't say another word. Not one. He lay against the wall and he watched a woman he'd called sweetheart yesterday morning direct the survival of his platoon. And the truth of what had happened started to settle over him like a weight he would carry for the rest of his life. Rachel didn't look at Kessler at all. She'd already moved on to Harker, checking the boy's color, checking his breathing, talking to him low and steady, the way you talk to a frightened animal, keeping him tethered to the world. "Stay with me, Harker. That's your name, right, Harker?" The boy nodded weakly. "You're going to be fine. You hear that A-bird's coming to get you, and you're going to be on a table with a surgeon inside the hour, and you're going to have a hell of a scar to show people." "What's your first name, Tom?" the boy whispered. "Tom." "Okay, Tom, you've got a girl back home." "Yeah." His eyes were losing focus. "Emily. Emily. Good. You're going to tell Emily about this. Tom, you understand me. You're going to sit on a porch someday, and you're going to tell Emily the story about the day you got shot in a canyon in Montana, and some lady you barely knew held your platoon together long enough to get you home. But that only happens if you stay awake and keep breathing for the next 20 minutes. Can you do that for Emily?" "Tom," Harker breathed. "Yeah, I can do that." "I know you can." She glanced at Doyle. "Keep him talking. Ask him about Emily. Don't let him drift." And Doyle, 19 years old, hands soaked in another man's blood, looked at Rachel Carter like she'd come down off the ridge and out of the sky both at once. And he nodded, and he started asking Tom Harker about a girl named Emily, and Tom Harker kept breathing. Rachel stood up. Her hands had stopped shaking. The work had steadied her the way it always did, the way it had been the only thing that ever really steadied her. She walked the perimeter Vance had set, checking it, adjusting one man's field of fire, moving another 6 feet to cover a gap. And the soldiers she passed watched her go by with expressions she'd never in 3 years seen aimed at her. Yesterday she'd been furniture. Today she was something they didn't have a word for. Sergeant Vance fell into step beside her. "Ma'am," he said, "I owe you an apology." "No, you don't." She didn't slow down. "You rerouted 2nd Squad 200 meters east this morning. You didn't have to. You didn't credit me for it, and you didn't tell anybody I'd been right about the slope. But you did it. That tells me everything I need to know about you, Sergeant. You listen even when it costs your pride, and that's rarer than you'd think. You don't owe me an apology. You just owe those kids the same thing you gave them today, which is your best. Keep giving them that." Vance was quiet for a few steps. "Range control said you were ours. What did they mean by that?" "Are you were you later," Rachel said. "The bird first. The story after." "Fair enough." He glanced at her sidelong. "That thing you did at the end, driving those last two into us. I've never seen anybody do that. Flush and drive, coordinate a maneuver element with precision fire on the fly, with a stranger with no comms plan and no rehearsal. That's not something you learn as a scout sniper. That's something else." Rachel didn't answer. She just kept scanning north, and Vance saw her jaw tighten just slightly, and he was smart enough not to push it. Then faint at first, then growing, they heard it. The heavy chop of rotor blades coming up the valley from the south, and every man on that perimeter felt his chest loosen at the sound of it. "There's your bird," Rachel said. "Pop smoke, mark your LZM, keep your security oriented north until the wheels are up. Nobody relaxes until we're all off the ground." The helicopter came in loud and low, and the medics were off it before it had fully settled, and they went to work on Harker and Kessler and the frag-wounded soldiers with the ruthless efficiency of people who did this for a living. Rachel stayed at the edge of it all, on the perimeter rifle still ready, still scanning that north end, because she had learned the hardest possible way that the moment you decide it's over is the moment it kills you. It wasn't until the wounded were loaded, until Vance had accounted for every single soldier, until the security team was climbing aboard and the crew chief was waving the last of them in, that Rachel finally let the muzzle of the M11 drop toward the ground. And it was in that exact moment, as she turned to walk toward the bird, that she saw it. Movement. North end of the valley. High on the west ridge, in a position she hadn't cleared because it had been behind cover from her angle the whole fight. A glint. A shape. An eighth man she hadn't counted, who hadn't fired a single shot the entire time, who had been watching the whole time, waiting a spotter or a commander or a sniper of their own, someone patient enough to hold his fire through the death of 7 of his men, rather than give away his position. And he was aiming, not at the helicopter, at her. Rachel had a fraction of a second, and in that fraction of a second, she did the only thing there was time to do, which was throw herself sideways and down as the round came. and she felt the sound and the fire of it. Before she felt the pain, felt the world spin, felt the rock come up to meet her, and somewhere very far away she heard Doyle screaming her name, and she heard Vance roaring for the security team to get eyes on the West Ridge, and she heard the crack of a dozen rifles opening up all at once, and then the cold gray sky was above her, and she couldn't quite remember how she'd gotten to be looking at it. And the last clear thought she had, before the edges of everything went soft, was that she'd broken her own rule. She'd decided it was over. The round had caught her high on the left side, and Rachel Carter knew the difference between a hit that kills you and a hit that just tries to, and this one was trying. She was on her back, and the sky was wrong, and there was a roaring in her ears that she slowly understood was the helicopter, and the gunfire braided together, and her left arm wouldn't do what she told it, and that was information that was useful. So she filed it away the way she filed everything, and she started giving her body orders one at a time. Roll. She rolled off the open ground into the shadow of a low shelf of rock, and the movement lit a bar of white fire down her side that made her vision gray at the edges. But she kept moving because a body that keeps moving is a body that isn't a stationary target. She's hit. Carter's hit. Doyle was screaming, and he started to break from cover to get to her, and Vance grabbed him by the back of his vest and hauled him down. "You move into that open ground, and you're the next one on your back," Private Vance snarled. "Suppression on that West Ridge now. Everybody hose that whole ridge line. I want so much lead in the air that man can't lift his head." The security team opened up in a wall of noise rifles, hammering tracers, reaching up toward the position where the eighth man had fired from. And for a few seconds, the whole world was just sound. Rachel got her back against the rock. She looked down at herself. The round had gone through the meat of her upper arm and shoulder high and outside, and it had torn a channel across her side that was bleeding but not spurting, which meant it hadn't found the artery, which meant she had time, which meant she wasn't going to die in the next 4 minutes, which was all she'd ever really asked of any wound. She got her right hand pressed against the worst of it, and she made herself breathe slow, all the way down the way she'd taught Harker to breathe 10 minutes ago, and the gray pulled back from the edges of her vision. Then she did the thing that no one watching could quite believe. She picked the rifle back up. The M110 had landed a foot away when she went down, and she dragged it to her with her good arm, and she got it up onto the rock shelf, and she pressed her cheek to the stock, and even with her left arm half dead and her side screaming, she got the reticle up onto that West Ridge because the security team's suppression was loud and impressive and completely ineffective, spraying rounds all over a ridgeline the size of a football field, and a spray never killed a patient man. A patient man waited out a spray. A patient man was at that very second repositioning to take a second shot, and this time he'd have a stationary target lying wounded behind a rock, and Rachel knew it because it was exactly what she would do. She had to find him before he found her. Again. Only now she had one working arm and a body that was starting to go into shock, and the clock was running down on both of them. "Vance," she shouted, and her voice came out weaker than she wanted, so she put more into it. "Vance, tell them to cease fire." Vance's head whipped around. "Say again, cease fire. They're wasting ammo, and they're covering the sound. I need to hear, cease fire all of them right now, trust me." And Vance, God bless him, made the call that no textbook would have told him to make. He trusted a woman lying in a spreading pool of her own blood over every instinct that told him to keep shooting. Cease fire, all elements hold," he roared. "Nobody shoots, hold your fire." The guns stopped, and into the sudden silence, Rachel listened. She'd learned this in a school that officially didn't exist in a program whose name she still couldn't say out loud. When you can't see a shooter, you don't look for him. You wait for him to tell you where he is. Everything a man does makes a sound or a movement, and a spray of panicked friendly fire drowns all of it, but silence lets you hear the small things. The scrape of a boot resetting on rock. The click of a bipod being repositioned. The tiny betraying details that patient men produce right before they shoot, because even patient men have to move to kill you. 3 seconds. 4. And there it was. Not a sound. A movement. Up on the West Ridge, 2/3 of the way to the north end, a shadow shifted in a cleft of rock that she'd been staring straight at without seeing, and the shadow resolved into the shape of a man settling in behind a rifle, and Rachel had him. He was 280 meters out uphill, And she was shooting one-armed with a body going into shock, and she had one chance because the second she fired and missed, he would kill her. She thought about none of that. She emptied her mind the way you empty a glass of water all at once and completely until there was nothing left in it but the reticle and the shape of the man and the small, still voice that had never once left her, even in 3 years of pretending to be someone else. She let out half her air. Her arm was shaking. She couldn't stop the shaking. So she stopped fighting it and she timed it instead, waited for the bottom of the tremor, the still point at the base of every shake, and in that fractional pause of stillness, she pressed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her wounded shoulder, and the pain nearly took her under. But through the gray, she saw the shotty on the ridge snap backward and go still, and this time it stayed still, and she knew the way. She always knew that it was done. "Target down," she whispered, and then the rifle slid out of her grip, and her cheek came to rest against the cold rock, and the gray came flooding back in, and this time she let it. Carter Doyle was there now. Vance had let him go, and the boy skidded to his knees beside her and got his hands on her wound the way she'd taught him to do for Harker. "No, no, no. Stay with me, Miss Carter. Stay awake. You gotta stay awake, Pressure," Rachel mumbled. "You're doing it right. Don't lift to look. Looking doesn't help. I know you told me. You told me. Just stay awake, okay?" Doyle's voice cracked. "The bird's right here. We're gonna get you on the bird. You're gonna be fine. You said everybody's fine if we get them out, Emily," Rachel said, and her mouth almost smiled. "Tell Harker. Tell him about Emily." "You can tell him yourself," Doyle said fiercely, pressing down harder. Sergeant, we need the medic now." The medics came off of the bird a second time, and they went to work on her with the same ruthless speed they'd used on the others. And one of them said something about the round being through and through. And one of them got a pressure dressing on her side, and one of them got a needle in her good arm. And through all of it, Rachel Carter drifted at the surface of consciousness, refusing to go all the way under. Because going all the way under felt too much like the last time. And she had promised herself 3 years ago that there would not be a last time. Vance crouched over her while the medics worked. "Ma'am, that last shot. 280 meters, one arm, wounded, no rest into a target you found by sound." He shook his head slowly. "I've been in this army 16 years. I have never seen anything like what you did today. Not in training, not downrange, not anywhere." "Who are you?" Rachel looked up at him. The morphine, or whatever they'd pushed into her, was starting to soften the edges of the pain, and it was softening the edges of her guard too, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt the old locked door in her chest come open just a crack. "I told you," she said. "Later. The story after." "You keep saying that," Vance's jaw worked. "You almost died before you could tell it. Maybe tell it now." But the medics were lifting her, and the movement blew all the softness away and replaced it with white fire. And Rachel Carter clamped back down on the door in her chest and rode the pain up onto the helicopter. And the last thing she saw of that valley was young Doyle standing in the wash of the rotors with his hands still red, watching her go, and Lieutenant Kessler on his stretcher looking anywhere but at her. The flight to the hospital at Malmstrom took 40 minutes, and Rachel spent most of it staring at the ceiling of the aircraft and not letting herself pass out because she didn't trust what she'd say if she did. Beside her, Harker was stable breathing, and once when the bird hit a pocket of turbulence, the boy's hand found hers across the gap between their litters and gripped it, and neither of them said anything, and neither of them let go until they landed. They took Harker into surgery first because the gut wound was worse. They took Rachel second. The surgeon who worked on her was a young major who kept up a running commentary the way some surgeons do, and at one point he stopped and said, "Ma'am, you've got scarring in this shoulder, old scarring. This isn't your first through and through, and this here, this pattern, this is fragmentation, years old. Where'd you get shot up like this?" Overseas Rachel said. "You military, not anymore." The major looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at the old scars, and then he looked at the way she'd walked in, one-armed after killing 8 men, and he decided he had all the answer he was going to get, and he went back to work. She was in recovery, drifting in and out when the first suit showed up. She knew he was a suit before she opened her eyes because civilians who show up at military hospitals to ask questions after a firefight are always suits, and suits always smell like a rental car and cheap coffee. She opened her eyes, and there he was, sitting in the chair beside her bed, a lean man in his 50s with a federal badge clipped to his belt in a face that had spent a career not showing anything it didn't want to show. "Ms. Carter," he said, "my name's Agent Bauer, Federal Task Force. I've been chasing the men you killed today for 2 months." He let that sit. "I'd like to talk to you about how a logistics contractor took apart a trained paramilitary assault element single-handed." "I'd like to sleep," Rachel said. "I'm sure you would." Bauer didn't move. "Here's my problem, Ms. Carter. I pulled your file, your official file, and your official file says you were an Army marksman, 4 deployments, medically discharged 3 years ago after an injury. Honorable, unremarkable, a woman who counts crates for a living now." He leaned forward. "But the thing that happened in that canyon today wasn't done by an Army marksman. I've seen what marksmen can do. What you did, the counter-sniper work, finding a concealed shooter by sound and killing him one-armed at nearly 300 meters, coordinating a maneuver element on the fly with no comms. That's not marksman work. That's not even scout sniper work. That's a whole different animal, and there's exactly one place in this country that trains people to be that animal, and its budget line doesn't officially exist." He tilted his head. "So which file is the real one? The one that says you count crates, or the one that got sealed?" Rachel closed her eyes, the morphine hummed, and the door in her chest, the one she'd kept locked for 3 years, creaked all the way open because she was too tired and too hurt and too far past pretending to hold it shut anymore. "Both," she said quietly. "Both files are real. That's the whole tragedy of it." Bauer waited. "3 years ago, I wasn't a scout sniper," Rachel said to the ceiling, because it was easier than saying it to a face. "I hadn't been a scout sniper for a long time. I was selected out of the sniper community into a counter-sniper element. The kind of unit that gets sent to protect the people who protect other people. The kind of unit whose members don't have names on any wall if they die." Her voice was flat, worn smooth. "We were good. We were the best. And then we got sent to protect a diplomatic movement in a place I can't say, and I read the ground the way I always read the ground, and I told my command the route was compromised. I told them the timing was wrong. I told them we were walking a soft target into a kill zone, and that someone on the inside had to have leaked the schedule because the enemy knew things they shouldn't have known. And they didn't listen," Bauer said. "It wasn't a question. They told me to stand down." Rachel's throat worked. "They told me a contractor, a woman, a shooter wasn't cleared to make that assessment. They told me the intelligence was solid and the route was fine, and my job was to pull a trigger, not to think. So I stood down. That was the order, and I followed it. And the movement went the way I said it would go, straight into the kill zone. And I watched from an overwatch position while the people I was supposed to protect died in front of me because I'd been told my judgment didn't count." The recovery room was very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped. "I broke," Rachel said simply. "Not that day. That day I did my job. I killed everyone I could reach, and I dragged out who I could, and I did everything right in the moment. But after the reports came, and when the after action got written, someone had to be responsible. And it wasn't going to be the command that ignored the warning, and it wasn't going to be the inside man who leaked the schedule because they never found him or they never wanted to find him. It was going to be me, the woman who fired her weapon without a clean authorization in the chaos, the contractor who didn't stay in her lane. They made me the story, medical discharge they called it, on account of the injury I took that day, which was real. But it wasn't the injury that ended me. It was the fact that I'd been right, and being right in front of the wrong people is the most dangerous thing you can do." "So you disappeared," Bauer said, "into logistics contracting, counting crates at a training range in Montana." "I disappeared into the one place I could still be near it," Rachel said, "without having to be it. I couldn't leave it completely, but I couldn't be it either. So I put myself at the edge where I could watch, where I could still read the ground, even if nobody would let me pull a trigger. And I told myself that was enough. For 3 years, I told myself that." She turned her head and looked at Bauer for the first time. "And then this morning, a boy named Doyle asked me about a battery manifest, and a lieutenant called me sweetheart, and by 9 o'clock, they were all going to die in a canyon. I'd warned them about exactly the way it happened the first time. Exactly the same. Command ignores the warning, soft target, walks into the kill zone, people I'm supposed to be able to help die in front of me because someone decided my judgment doesn't count." Her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. "Only this time, nobody could give me the order to stand down. This time, I was just a civilian. And it turns out that just a civilian is the freest thing you can be because nobody can tell a civilian to watch people die. Bauer was silent for a long moment. The men you killed, he said finally, you want to know who they really were? They were a paramilitary cell testing military response times, probing installations. Reyes told me. That's the cover story we've been feeding people. It's not the whole truth. Bauer reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph and held it up. It was a surveillance shot, grainy, two men shaking hands in a parking lot. The man on the left is the leader of the cell you killed today. The man on the right, we've been trying to identify him for 2 months. Yesterday, we finally did. He paused. He's a serving military intelligence officer, assigned to the regional command that oversees the Blackthorn training range. He's the one who fed them your platoon's movement schedule this morning. The route, the timing, the soft target. The room tilted, and this time it had nothing to do with the morphine. An inside man, Rachel said very slowly. An inside man. Bauer put the photograph away. The same kind of inside man who leaked a diplomatic route into a kill zone 3 years ago and let a counter-sniper take the fall for it. Now, I'm not saying it is connected. I don't have that yet, but I've been doing this a long time, Miss Carter, and I don't much believe in coincidences. Somebody's been selling movement schedules to hostile elements for years, and every time the operation goes bad, it's a shooter who takes the blame. Never the man in the intelligence shop who sold the schedule. He stood up. You took the fall once for a leak you tried to warn people about. Today you stopped a leak from getting a whole platoon killed. And the man behind it is still sitting in an office at regional command, and right now he thinks his cell just failed, and he's got no idea that the woman who wrecked his operation is the same woman he helped destroy 3 years ago. Rachel stared at him. I don't understand, she said. Why are you telling me this? Why are you telling a civilian any of this? Bauer walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame, and he looked back at her, and for the first time, the career flat face showed something underneath. Because I read your sealed file, Ms. Carter, all of it, including the part where you named the exact vulnerability 3 years ago that got exploited, the exact kind of inside leak, and nobody listened, and they buried you for it. His voice hardened. I've got a serving officer selling out American soldiers, and I can't prove it yet, and the one person alive who's already inside his head, who already knows exactly how he thinks because you called his play 3 years before I ever caught the scent, is lying in this bed. So I'm not telling a civilian. I'm telling the only person who ever saw this coming. He held her gaze. The question is whether you're done watching from the edge. And then he was gone, and Rachel Carter lay in the recovery room with the monitors beeping and the morphine humming and 3 years of carefully constructed silence lying in pieces around her. And for the first time since a canyon in a country she couldn't name, she felt the thing she'd buried the deepest start to move again in her chest. Not grief, not shame, not even anger, though there was plenty of that. Purpose. The door down the hall opened, and she heard boots, and then Sergeant Vance was standing in the doorway of her recovery room, out of his gear now in a clean uniform, his face drawn and tired, but his eyes clear. Behind him, hanging back, hovering, like he wasn't sure he was allowed in, was young Doyle, scrubbed clean, his hands no longer red. They told me you'd pull through, Vance said. I wanted to see it for myself, Harkin Rachel asked. Out of surgery. Stable. Surgeon says he'll keep the leg and everything else. Vance's mouth twitched. He's already asking when he can call somebody named Emily. Something in Rachel's chest eased a small, warm loosening. Good. Vance came into the room. Doyle followed, still hovering. Kessler's been relieved pending investigation, Vance said. His account of what happened out there doesn't match anybody else's account of what happened out there. And there are 11 of us and one of him, and every one of us saw the same thing. He looked at her steadily. We all told them the same story, ma'am. That we'd be dead, every one of us, if a logistics contractor hadn't picked up a rifle when our own lieutenant froze. They can write it however they want up the chain. But that's what happened, and that's what we said, and we're not going to unsay it. Doyle stepped forward, then past Vance, and the boy's throat worked, and when he spoke, his voice was thick. I threw the extra batteries in my ruck, he said. Like you told me. When our comms died, I switched to the backup, and it was the only radio in the whole platoon still working, and it's the reason range control even knew we were in trouble. He swallowed hard. You saved us before you ever picked up the rifle, ma'am. You saved us the day before at the supply office when everybody was laughing at you and you told me to pack the batteries anyway. The boy's eyes filled. Why'd you do that? Why'd you help us when we treated you like you were nothing? Rachel looked at the boy, 19 years old, who reminded her of every young soldier she'd ever watched walk toward danger with no idea what it would take from them. Because you weren't nothing, she said quietly. None of you were. You were somebody's whole world about to walk into a kill zone. And I've stood by once and let people walk into a kill zone because somebody told me to. I wasn't going to do it twice, no matter what any of you thought of me. She held Doyle's gaze. What people think of you isn't the reason you do the right thing, Doyle. You do the right thing because it's the right thing. You'll be a good soldier if you remember that. Better than the ones who laughed. Doyle wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and nodded, and didn't trust himself to say anything else. Vance was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled the chair up to the bed, the one Bauer had left, and he sat down in it, and he folded his hands. That agent, he said, the federal one. I saw him leave. He was here a long time. Rachel said nothing. Ma'am, 16 years I've been doing this, and I know the difference between a firefight that just happened and a firefight that was set up. Those men knew where we'd be. They knew the timing. They had the choke point sealed before we ever hit the valley floor. His voice dropped. Somebody sold us. Somebody who knew our movement schedule sold it. And that agent didn't drive all the way out here to congratulate a civilian on a good day's shooting. He came here because you know something, or you are something that matters to whatever comes next. Rachel looked at the sergeant who'd called her lost, who'd told her she was on a nature walk, who trusted her with the lives of his men the moment it counted, who had told a wounded lieutenant to shut up rather than let him question her one more time. And she made a decision that she would not have made 3 years ago, or 3 days ago, or even 3 hours ago, for a federal agent had held up a photograph of a serving officer shaking hands with the man she'd killed. You want the story, Rachel said. The one I kept saying was for later. I do, Vance said, but only if you want to tell it. Rachel was quiet for a long moment. The monitor beeped. Somewhere outside, a helicopter was spinning up, and the sound of the rotors climbed and climbed. Then close the door, Sergeant, she said, because it's not just a story. And after I tell you, you're going to have to decide whether you were ever really just a soldier who followed orders. The same way I had to decide this morning whether I was ever really just a civilian. Vance held her eyes for a long beat. Then he got up and he closed the door. The door clicked shut, and Rachel Carter told Sergeant Vance everything. She told him about the counter-sniper element and the diplomatic movement and the route she'd read as compromised. She told him about the order to stand down and the people she'd watched die through an optic she wasn't allowed to fire. She told him about the after-action report that turned a leak into her fault about the medical discharge that was really an Excel about 3 years of counting crates at the edge of a world she couldn't leave and couldn't rejoin. And then she told him the part Bauer had told her, the photograph, the serving intelligence officer at Regional Command shaking hands with a man she'd killed that morning, the leak that had never stopped the pattern that stretched back years with a shooter taking the fall every single time. When she finished, Vance sat very still in the chair for a long time. So the same kind of man who got your people killed 3 years ago, he said, slowly, just tried to get my people killed this morning, and he's still out there, in a uniform, in an office. That's what the agent believes, Rachel said. He can't prove it yet. Vance's jaw worked. What does he need to prove it? He needs the officer to move. Men like that don't get caught sitting still. They get caught when they panic when an operation fails, and they scramble to cover the trail before it leads back to them. Rachel shifted against the pillows, and pain flared down her side, and she wrote it out. His cell failed today. 7 men dead, 1 more I put down on the ridge. That officer is sitting in his office right now, realizing his whole operation just collapsed, and he has no idea why. No idea who wrecked it, no idea whether the survivors saw anything that points at him. He's going to be afraid, and afraid is when they move. And you know how he thinks, Vance said, because you called this exact play 3 years before Bauer ever caught the scent. I know how he thinks. Vance stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, and when he turned around, his face had changed, hardened into something she recognized, the face of a man who has just decided that following orders and doing right are not always the same thing, and that he knows which one matters more. Then tell me what you need, he said. Because 11 of my soldiers are alive tonight who shouldn't be, and if the man who tried to kill them is going to walk because a federal agent can't build a case, then I've got a problem with that, ma'am. A real problem. Rachel looked at him for a long moment, And something loosened in her that had been locked tight for 3 years because for the first time since a canyon in a country she couldn't name, she was not standing alone at the edge of a thing that mattered. 2 days later, she checked herself out of the hospital against medical advice. The surgeon argued. Rachel signed the form. Her left arm was in a sling and her side was stitched and taped, and she moved like a woman who'd been shot 2 days ago because she was one. But she walked out under her own power, and Vance was waiting in the parking lot in a civilian truck, and Agent Bauer was in the passenger seat. "This is a bad idea," Bauer said as she climbed in. "You're a civilian and you're wounded, and if this goes sideways, I can't protect you." "You came to my hospital room and told me I was the only person who ever saw this coming," Rachel said. "You don't get to say that and then tell me to stay in bed. Pick one." Bauer almost smiled. He didn't quite make it, but he almost did. Here is what Bauer had and what he didn't. He had a photograph of the officer, a lieutenant colonel named Prater, shaking hands with a dead man. He had 2 months of surveillance that put Prater near suspicious meetings without ever quite catching him at the exchange. He had the movement schedule that had been leaked to the cell, and he had confirmed that Prater was one of only 9 people with access to it. What he did not have was proof. He did not have the moment of exchange, the transfer of information, the smoking gun. And Prater was careful, and Prater was protected by rank and by an institution that did not want to believe one of its own intelligence officers had been selling soldiers, and every day that passed was a day Prater had to clean his trail. "He's going to try to move the last of his network," Rachel said as they drove. "He's lost his shooters. That's a catastrophe for him, but it's also loose ends. The men I killed had handler safe houses away they got paid. Prater's going to be scrambling to sever every connection between himself and that cell before you follow the bodies back to him. That means he has to make contact with whoever ran the money side, and that's when you take him." "We've been watching him for 2 months, Bauer said. "He doesn't make contact carelessly. He didn't have to 2 months ago. 2 months ago, his operation was healthy, and he could take his time." Rachel stared out the windshield. Now his operation is a smoking hole, and he's afraid. And afraid men make the mistakes careful men never make. You've been watching him wrong. You've been watching him like a hunter watching prey. Start watching him like I watch a target. Don't wait for him to expose himself. Give him a reason to run." Bauer turned in his seat. "What kind of reason?" "Let him find out that one of his cells survived." The truck was quiet. "None of them survived," Vance said. "You killed all 8. "Prater doesn't know that." Rachel's voice was flat and cold and certain. "All Prater knows is that his operation failed and his men went silent. If a rumor reaches him that one of his cell was captured alive, wounded in federal custody talking, he doesn't have the luxury of being careful anymore. A captured man who talks leads straight to him. He'll have to move to protect himself. He'll have to make contact with his network to either silence the leak or run. And the moment he moves, you're there." Bauer stared at her for a long moment. "You want to run a deception operation on a serving military intelligence officer, using a rumor we manufacture. I want to make a frightened man act like a frightened man," Rachel said. "That's not a deception operation. That's just understanding people." It took Bauer a day to make the arrangements, and the arrangements were the kind that lived in the gray space between what was legal and what was necessary, and Rachel didn't ask about all of them, and Bauer didn't offer. What mattered was that by the following evening, a carefully constructed piece of information had been allowed to leak into exactly the right channel. A whisper that one member of the Blackthorn cell had been taken alive wounded and was being held at a federal facility while he cooperated with investigators. And then they watched Lieutenant Colonel Prater. They watched him from a surveillance van 2 blocks from his quarters, and Rachel sat in the back of that van with her arm in its sling and her eyes on the monitors, and she read the man the way she read everything from the small betraying details. The way he came home 20 minutes early, the way the lights in his quarters went on and off in the wrong rooms at the wrong times, a man pacing a man who couldn't settle. The way he opened his blinds twice to look at the street and then closed them again. "There," Rachel said quietly at 9:40 in the evening. "He's afraid. Look at him. He can't sit still. 2 days ago, he was a careful man. Now he's a man waiting for a knock on the door." "How can you tell all that from the blinds?" Vance murmured. "Because I've been that man," Rachel said. "Not selling anybody, but waiting for the knock, waiting to find out if the thing you did was going to come back and end you. I know exactly what that looks like from the inside, so I know exactly what it looks like from the outside. At 10:15, Prater's lights went out. Not the pattern of a man going to sleep. The pattern of a man who wanted the street to think he'd gone to sleep. He's gonna move, Rachel said. Tonight, tell your people to be ready. At 11:02, a car left the rear of Prater's quarters with its headlights off. There he goes, Bauer breathed into his radio. All units subject is mobile running. Dark, do not lose him. Do not spook him. Let him lead us. What followed was the longest hour of Vance's life, and he suspected one of the more ordinary hours of Rachel Carter's, because she sat in the back of that van, perfectly calm, while Prater's car wound through back roads and doubled back on itself and did all the things a frightened man does when he thinks he might be followed. And every time it looked like they'd lose him, Rachel would say quietly, "He'll turn left here. He's heading for someplace he thinks is safe. Someplace with only one road in," and Prater would turn left, and Bauer would look at her like she was reading the man's mind. And in a way she was, because she'd spent 3 years learning to think like the enemy she'd never been allowed to name. Prater's car finally stopped at a self-storage facility on the edge of town, the kind of place with rows of numbered units and a keypad gate and no cameras that worked, and he let himself in and drove to a unit at the far back corner and killed his engine. "That's his cutout," Rachel said. "That's where he keeps whatever connects him to the cell. Cache a burner phone documents a way to reach his handler. He's not here to hide. He's here to either destroy it or grab it and run. And whoever he calls from here, whoever he reaches out to now that he thinks one of his men is talking, that's your case, Bauer. That's the connection you've been trying to catch for 2 months. It's about to happen inside that unit." Bauer's hand tightened on the radio. "We move now? We've got him breaking into a storage unit at midnight. That's nothing. That's not a crime that sticks to a colonel with lawyers. So don't move now," Rachel said. "Wait for the call." They waited. And inside the storage unit unseen, Lieutenant Colonel Prater made the call that a careful man would never have made, the call of a frightened man who believed one of his own could put him in a cell for the rest of his life. And Bauer's surveillance team caught every word of it, the whole rotten architecture of it, a serving officer arranging to have a wounded prisoner silenced and to have himself extracted across a border before the investigation could reach him. "That's it," Bauer whispered. And there was something almost reverent in it, 2 months of frustration collapsing into a single clean moment. That's the whole thing, conspiracy obstruction, and he just ordered a hit on a federal prisoner who doesn't exist. "All units, we have what we need. Take him. Take him now." And they took him. Rachel watched it on the monitors, watched the federal agents flow in around the storage unit, watched Lieutenant Colonel Prater step out with his hands up and his face gray. A careful man undone by his own fear, and she felt none of the triumph she thought she might feel. She just felt tired, and she felt the old wound in her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with the bullet. Because it should have been enough 3 years ago. Someone should have listened 3 years ago, and people had died because no one did, and no amount of catching Prater tonight brought them back. Vance was watching her. "You okay, ma'am?" "No," Rachel said honestly, "but I will be." It was 3 in the morning by the time the paperwork of the arrest had settled enough for Bauer to come back to the van, and when he did, he wasn't alone. There was a general with him. Not a colonel this time, not the mid-level authority that had burned up the phone lines the morning of the ambush, demanding to know who authorized a civilian. A general 2 stars in a uniform that had clearly been pulled on in a hurry in the middle of the night, and his name was Hallstrom. And he was the man who commanded the entire region, the man whose command Prater had rotted from the inside. General Hallstrom climbed into the back of the van and looked at Rachel Carter, a wounded woman in a sling sitting on a jump seat in a surveillance vehicle at 3 in the morning, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. "Ms. Carter," he finally said, "Agent Bauer has been briefing me for the last hour about today, about 3 years ago, about the file that got sealed." His voice was rough. "I've been in this army 34 years. And I want to tell you that what happened to you 3 years ago was wrong, that the system worked the way it was supposed to, that there was some good reason your warning got buried and you got blamed. I want to tell you that, but I've read the file now, all of it, and I can't. Because it wasn't wrong the way a mistake is wrong. It was wrong the way a cover-up is wrong. Somebody made a decision 3 years ago that it was easier to end your career than to admit that one of our own had leaked that route. And I don't yet know who made that decision. But I'm going to find out." Rachel looked at him. She'd heard a lot of words from a lot of officers in her life, and she'd learned to hear the difference between the ones who were managing her and the ones who meant it. And this man, tired and gray and pulled out of bed at 3 in the morning to face a thing his institution had done, this man meant it. With respect, General, she said, I stopped needing anyone to tell me I was right a long time ago. I know I was right. I've always known. I believe you do, Hallstrom said. But there's a difference between you knowing it and it being true on the record. Right now, the record says you're a washed-out contractor who happened to get lucky with a rifle, and I am not going to let that record stand. He leaned forward. The men in that platoon told the truth about what you did. All 11 of them straight up the chain, no wavering. Lieutenant Kessler tried to muddy it, and every one of his own soldiers contradicted him to his face. That doesn't happen, Ms. Carter. Soldiers protect their officers, even bad ones, out of instinct. For an entire platoon to break that instinct and stand behind a civilian instead, you must have done something out there that changed what those men believe a person can be. Vance spoke up from the corner of the van, quiet and firm. She saved every one of us, sir. That's what she did. And then she got shot doing it and picked the rifle back up and did it again. There's no muddying that. We won't let it be muddied. Hallstrom looked at the sergeant and then back at Rachel, and something settled in his face. There's going to be an after-action review, he said, a formal one, not the kind that buries people, the kind that puts the truth on the record where it can't be sealed again. Prater's arrest is going to blow open 3 years of leaks, and when it does, your case is going to be reopened, and this time it's going to be reopened by people who already know the answer. I can't give you back 3 years, Ms. Carter. Nobody can. But I can make sure that the last time anyone ever calls you just a civilian is the last time anyone ever calls you that. He paused. If you'll let me, you'll. Rachel was quiet for a long moment. Outside the van, the sky was starting to go from black to the first faint gray of morning, and she was tired all the way to the bone, and her side hurt, and her arm hurt, and 3 years of exile sat heavy on her shoulders. But underneath all of it, that thing Bauer had woken in her hospital room was still moving, still alive, the thing she'd buried the deepest. There's going to be a review, she said slowly. A formal one. On the record. Yes. And the same chain of command that buried me 3 years ago is going to have to sit in a room and account for it. In front of witnesses. On paper that can't be sealed. Yes, Hallstrom said. Every one of them who's still serving. And some who thought they'd retired out of reach. Rachel looked at Vance, and she looked at Bauer, and she looked at the general who'd been pulled out of bed to face what his institution had done, and for the first time in 3 years, she let herself want something out loud. Then I'll be there, she said. Word of it moved faster than anyone expected. By the time the sun was fully up, the story of the Blackthorn ambush had started to travel first through the units at the range, then wider the story of a platoon that walked into a kill zone and should have died to a man, and the logistics contractor who'd been laughed at the day before and who'd picked up a rifle and killed 8 trained fighters to bring them home. It traveled the way the best stories travel in the military, soldier to soldier. And it did not travel with her being called a civilian. It traveled with a different word attached to her, one that had to be earned, one that couldn't be given by any rank or any paperwork. And the word was hers now, no matter what the sealed file said. Lieutenant Kessler heard the story too, from a hospital bed of his own, his shoulder in a sling, not unlike hers. And Kessler, to the surprise of everyone, including himself, did something in the days that followed that no one who'd known him would have predicted. When the investigators came to take his statement, when he had every incentive to protect himself, to shade the truth, to make his freezing in that valley into something less than what it was, Kessler looked at the investigator and he told the truth. All of it. The way he dismissed her warnings about the batteries and the slope. The way he'd called her sweetheart in front of his men. The way he'd frozen when the shooting started, and a woman he'd mocked had done the job he was supposed to do. He put it all on the record, unflinching, and when the investigator asked him why he was being so forthcoming when it made him look so bad, Kessler was quiet for a moment. Because she didn't leave me out there, he said finally. I called her nothing, and then I froze, and she still came up that ridge and killed 8 men to save my life along with everybody else's. The least I can do is not lie about who actually did the saving. He looked at his hands. I've got a lot of things to be ashamed of from that day. I'm not going to add lying to the list. The review was set for 2 weeks out to give Prater's arrest time to fully unravel and to give Rachel's stitches time to come out. And in those 2 weeks, as the investigation spread and the truth started coming loose from 3 years of careful burial, a name surfaced that Rachel had not expected, a name from her own past, from the command that had told her to stand down and then made her the story. The officer who'd written the after-action report 3 years ago, the one who'd turned a leak into her fault, the one who'd signed off on ending her career to protect the chain of command, was a major back then. He wasn't a major anymore. He'd been promoted twice since. And he'd been promoted, Bauer discovered, on the recommendation of the man who'd run the whole rotten network from the top. A man who was not Prater at all. A man who was Prater's handler. A man who had spent years selling the movements of American soldiers and who had used Rachel Carter as the cover story for the very first leak he'd ever been afraid of being caught for. Bauer brought her the file himself, and he laid it on the table in front of her, and he watched her face as she read the name at the top of it. "You know him," Bauer said. It wasn't a question. "Don't you?" Rachel stared at the name for a long time. And when she looked up, her face had gone to the still, cold place. And it went right before she took a shot she could not afford to miss. "He was my commanding officer," she said quietly. 3 years ago, he was the one who gave me the order to stand down. He was the one who told me a contractor, a woman, a shooter, wasn't cleared to make that assessment. Her voice didn't shake. That was the frightening part. It didn't shake at all. He told me to watch them die. And then he wrote the report that said it was my fault. And now you're telling me he's the reason it happened in the first place. That he sold that route himself and blamed me to bury it and has been doing it ever since. That's what the evidence says, Bauer said. He's a full colonel now, decorated, untouchable, everyone thought, until Prater panicked and made a phone call, and the phone call led up a chain that ends at his desk. He leaned forward. "The review's in 10 days. He's going to be in that room, Rachel. He has to be. He's still in the chain of command that oversaw Blackthorn, and protocol requires him to attend. He doesn't know we've connected him yet. He thinks he's coming to a routine after-action review about an ambush that failed." Rachel closed the file, and for the first time in 3 years she smiled, and it was not a warm smile, and it was not a cruel one either. It was the smile of a woman who had waited a very long time in silence, keeping the truth locked away until the exact moment it could do the most damage, and who had just been told that the moment was finally coming. "He gave me an order to be silent," she said, "and I've been silent for 3 years. She slid the file back across the table to Bauer. 10 days. Let him walk into that room thinking he's safe. Let him sit down across from the woman he buried, and let him believe right up until the last second that she's still just a civilian." Part 5 lưu ý Việt đủ 6.000 đến 6.500 từ. Liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng. Hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách truyền Mỹ Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh, tập trung vào hành động, cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Viết phần 5 đạt điểm 10 trên 10 và bổ sung tiết tấu câu chuyện nhanh, sửa lỗi ai. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3 giữ độ kịch tính, không viết lan man. Kết thúc dùng câu khẳng định mạnh để khép lại câu chuyện rõ ràng, trọn vẹn. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang mục document 12 đến 3 phút. Cần có mini climax và đạt 10 đến 15. Mini climax mời phần cu 10 đến 12 phút, có một twist lớn sâu sắc. Đan xen mini cliffhanger mạnh hơn, tăng tính tự nhiên cho phản ứng của các nhân vật, thêm nhịp điệu, kịch tính thực tế và gần gũi. Mỗi 8 đến 10 phút cần có móc giữ chân khán giả. Lưu ý không mô tả cảnh, viết văn bản phù hợp với thesis và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng lệnh nhé. Show more. 10 days later. Rachel Carter walked into the review room without a sling. The stitches were out. The arms still ached and would ache for months, but she'd left the sling in the truck on purpose because she was not going to walk into that room looking like anything a man could pity or dismiss. She wore civilian clothes, plain and clean, and she carried nothing but herself. And she took a seat at the far end of the long table where the witnesses sat, and she waited. The room filled slowly. General Hallstrom took his place at the head of the table, and beside him sat the investigating officers, and along one wall sat the soldiers of Blackthorn, 2-6 in their dress uniforms. Every one of them who could stand, and there was Vance, and there was Doyle. And there, thinner and paler, but on his own 2 feet, was Tom Harker, who had insisted on coming, even though the surgeons had told him to stay in bed. And there, in a chair near the back with his arm still in its own sling, was Lieutenant Kessler, who had asked to attend and been granted it, and who would not meet anyone's eyes. And then the last of them came in, and the room changed. He was a full colonel now, silver eagles on his shoulders, and he walked in the way men walk when they have spent a career believing the ground bends to them. His name was Colonel Merrick, and 3 years ago he had been the major who told Rachel Carter to stand down and watch people die, and then wrote the report that made it her fault. He hadn't aged so much as hardened, and he moved through the room, shaking hands, nodding at the general, playing the part of the senior officer come to lend his experience to a routine review of an unfortunate incident. He did not recognize Rachel at first. Why would he? She was a civilian at the end of the table, a contractor, a background figure. He'd spent 3 years not thinking about her at all. His eyes passed over her the way they'd passed over her 1,000 times in another life, and moved on, and he took his seat near the head of the table with the easy confidence of a man who believed he was among the judges and not the judged. Rachel watched him sit down. She said nothing. She'd been saying nothing for 3 years. She could wait a little longer. General Hallstrom opened the review. He laid out the facts of the Blackthorn ambush, plainly the training exercise, the loss of communications, the paramilitary cell, the 11 survivors. And then he began to walk through the timeline, and as he did, he called on the witnesses one by one, and the truth of that day began to build in the room like a pressure. Vance spoke first, and he spoke without flinching, and he told them exactly what had happened. The platoon pinned the lieutenant, frozen the wounded in the open, and then a woman coming down off the ridge who'd killed the men who were killing them. Doyle spoke, his voice cracking, and told them about the batteries, about the warning at the supply office the day before, about a radio that worked when every other one had died because a contractor had told him to pack extras and keep them warm. Harker spoke quiet and steady and told them about a woman kneeling over him in the dirt, asking him about a girl named Emily, keeping him tethered to the world while a helicopter came. And Colonel Merrick listened to all of it with the polite, faintly impatient expression of a senior officer sitting through testimony that didn't concern him, and he still did not understand where he was. Then Kessler spoke. Kessler stood up, and he did not spare himself, and he told the room every shameful thing. How he'd dismissed the warnings, how he'd called her sweetheart, how he'd frozen when it mattered. And then he said the thing that started to turn the room. I want to be clear about something, Kessler said, his voice tight. The contractor didn't just save us with a rifle. She tried to save us the day before with a warning we laughed at, and the day before that with an assessment of the terrain that Sergeant Vance quietly acted on, and that kept Second Squad out of a collapse zone. She saw all of it coming, every piece, and every single one of us, myself most of all, treated her like she was nothing because she wasn't wearing a uniform. He looked down the table, and for the first time, his eyes found Rachel's and held them. I've had 2 weeks to think about why nobody listened to her, and I keep coming back to the same answer. We didn't listen because listening would have meant admitting that a woman we decided was beneath us understood the battlefield better than we did. And I think that's the ugliest thing I've ever had to learn about myself. The room was very quiet, and it was General Hallstrom who turned then slowly, deliberately to Colonel Merrick and said, "Colonel, you've reviewed a great many after-action reports in your career. You have a reputation for it. I'd value your assessment. In your professional opinion, when a subordinate provides an accurate warning of a compromise and is overruled by command and casualties result, where does the accountability lie?" Merrick smiled, comfortable in his element. "Well, General, that's a complex question. Command has to weigh many sources of intelligence. A single voice, particularly one outside the formal chain, can't be allowed to override an operational plan. Sometimes a warning happens to be correct in hindsight, but command can't act on hindsight. The accountability, in my experience, lies with the failure of the intelligence picture as a whole, not with any one decision." "I see," Hallstrom said. "So the person who gave the correct warning bears no fault?" "Of course not. And the command that overruled the correct warning bears no fault either, because they couldn't have known in advance the warning was correct." "Precisely. It's the intelligence system that fails in these cases, sir, not individuals." Hallstrom nodded slowly as if considering it. "That's interesting, Colonel, because that's almost word for word what you wrote 3 years ago, in a different after-action report, about a different compromise movement." The smallest flicker crossed Merrick's face. "Just a flicker. I've written many reports, General. You have. Hallstrom opened a folder in front of him. Let me refresh your memory about this particular one. 3 years ago, a counter-sniper element was tasked to protect a diplomatic movement. One member of that element assessed the route as compromised, warned that the schedule had been leaked, warned that they were walking a soft target into a kill zone, and that the leak had to be internal. That member was ordered to stand down by her commanding officer. The movement proceeded. It went into the kill zone exactly as she'd predicted. People died. Hallstrom's voice never rose, and that made it worse. And afterward, the after-action report determined that the fault lay with, and I'm quoting you now, Colonel, the failure of the intelligence picture as a whole. Not with the command decision to overrule the warning, and certainly not with the commanding officer who gave the order to stand down. He looked up. Do you remember who that commanding officer was? Colonel Merrick. The room had gone absolutely still, and Merrick for the first time looked down the length of the table at the civilian woman he'd passed over on his way in, and Rachel Carter looked back at him, and she watched the recognition arrive on his face like a slow tide, and she did not smile, and she did not look away. You, Rachel said quietly into the silence. The commanding officer was you. Merrick's mouth opened. You told me to stand down, Rachel said, and she stood up now, slowly, and her voice was calm and clear, and it filled the room without her ever raising it. You told me a contractor, a woman, a shooter, wasn't cleared to make that assessment. You told me my job was to pull a trigger and not to think. And I followed your order, Colonel. I stood down. And I watched people I was sworn to protect die through an optic I wasn't allowed to fire because you told me to. You're out of line, Merrick said, but his voice had lost something. And then you wrote the report, Rachel went on, unhurried, relentless. You turned a leak into my fault. You ended my career to protect yourself. You called it a medical discharge, and you buried me in a supply office at the edge of nowhere, and you moved on, and you got promoted twice, and you never once thought about me again. She took a breath. Except you had a reason to bury it that I didn't understand until 10 days ago. Because it wasn't just command failure that leaked that route 3 years ago, was it, Colonel? You knew the leak was internal because the leak was you. You sold that movement. And when the one person on your team read the ground and called it, you couldn't afford to let that warning stand because an investigation into an internal leak might have found its way back to you. So you gave me an order to be silent. And then you made me the story so no one would ever look past me to you. This is a fantasy, Merrick snapped, and now he was on his feet too. General, I don't know what this woman has told you, but she is a discharged contractor with a grievance, and I will not sit here and be... Sit down, Colonel General Hallstrom said. General, I have a right to sit down. And into that moment, the door opened, and Agent Bauer walked in, and behind him came 2 federal agents, and behind them came a man in handcuffs whom Merrick clearly recognized because all the blood went out of his face at once. Colonel Merrick Bauer said pleasantly, I believe you know Lieutenant Colonel Prater. He's been very talkative these past 10 days. Turns out a man facing conspiracy and attempted murder of a federal prisoner is willing to say a great deal about the officer who's been running him for years, about the movement schedules you sold, about the cell you fed, about Blackthorn. Bauer's pleasant tone dropped away entirely, and about a diplomatic movement 3 years ago, which was your very first sale and the one you were most afraid of being caught for, which is why you needed a scapegoat so badly that you destroyed one of the finest counter-snipers this country ever trained to save your own skin. Merrick stood frozen at the head of the table, and Rachel watched the careful architecture of 3 years collapse in his face, and she felt at last the thing she'd waited 3 years to feel. And it was not triumph, and it was not joy. It was something quieter and heavier and more complete. It was the feeling of the truth finally standing up in a room where it could not be sealed away again. Colonel Merrick Bauer said, you're under arrest. They took him out in handcuffs past the soldiers of Blackthorn, 2-6, past the general, past the woman he'd buried, and he did not look at any of them, and the door closed behind him, and the room let out a breath it had been holding for the length of a career. General Hallstrom sat quietly for a moment. Then he closed the folder in front of him, and he looked down the table at Rachel. The record of your discharge is going to be corrected, he said, fully, formally, on paper that cannot be sealed. The finding of fault against you 3 years ago is vacated as of today, and the truth is going to replace it, and everyone in the chain who signed off on burying you is going to answer for it. He paused. That's the least of what you're owed, and it's the most I can give. I know it doesn't return the 3 years. Nothing does. No, Rachel said. Nothing does. There's more, Hallstrom said. The Army would like to offer you a return to service. Full reinstatement, restored rank back pay. You'd have your career again. You'd have everything they took. He watched her carefully. You'd be one of us again. And the room waited because it was a thing every one of them thought she'd want. The thing they thought this had all been for. The vindication made complete. The exile ended. The uniform returned. Rachel was quiet for a long moment. She looked around the room at Vance, who'd trusted her when it counted, at Doyle, who'd packed the batteries, at Harker, who was alive because of a girl named Emily, at Kessler, who'd told the truth when a lie would have been easier. And she looked down at her own hands, the hands that had held a rifle on a ridge with one arm dead and a body going into shock. The hands that had spent 3 years counting crates because it was the only way she could stay near the thing she loved without being allowed to be it. No, she said. The room went still with surprise. I appreciate it, General. I do. But I didn't come back for the uniform. I didn't come back for reinstatement or back pay or my rank. She looked at Merrick's empty chair. And I didn't come back for validation. I already knew I was right. I've always known. Having it on paper is a kindness, and I'll take it, but it was never the thing I needed. She looked at the soldiers along the wall. I came back because someone had to survive. Because a boy named Doyle asked me about a battery manifest. And I'd stood by once and watched people die on an order, and I wasn't going to do it twice. That's all. That's the whole reason. Then what will you do? Hallstrom asked quietly. If not this. And Rachel Carter smiled, and this time it was warm because she'd known the answer to that question since the moment she came down off the ridge and found young Doyle with his hands red and his eyes full of a terror no 19-year-old should have to carry. There are people out there who read the ground the way I do, she said. Young ones, the ones who see it coming and don't have the words yet, or the rank, or anyone willing to listen. 3 years ago, I was one of them, and the system broke me for it instead of using me. I'm not going back into the fight, General, but I'll teach. I'll take the ones everyone underestimates, the ones who get called just a civilian, or just a woman, or just a kid who files paperwork, and I'll teach them everything I know, so that the next time somebody reads the ground and calls a compromise, there's a whole generation of people trained to listen. She looked around the room one last time. That's a better use of what I am than putting the uniform back on. I don't need to pull the trigger anymore. I need to make sure the right people are holding the rifle when it matters, and the right people are standing behind them when they call it. General Hallstrom looked at her for a long moment, and then he stood, and every soldier in the room stood with him and Sergeant Vance, 16 years in the Army, who had once called her lost, who had once told her she was on a nature walk in a restricted zone, snapped to attention, and rendered her a salute. And one by one, every soldier of Blackthorn 2-6 did the same. And even Kessler, with his arm in a sling, rose and saluted the woman he'd called sweetheart. And it was the only salute any of them would ever render to a person in civilian clothes. And every one of them meant it more than any salute they'd ever given in their lives. Rachel didn't salute back. She wasn't a soldier anymore, and she'd made her peace with that. She just nodded once to all of them, and she turned, and she walked toward the door. Doyle's voice stopped her. Ma'am, the boy said, when you start teaching, those people you are going to train. He swallowed. Is there any chance a guy like me could learn from you someday? Somebody who almost didn't get it, but who packed the batteries anyway. Rachel looked back at him, at the hopeful, earnest face that hadn't been tested when she first met him and had been tested to the breaking point since and had held. Doyle, she said, you already learned the most important thing I could ever teach you. You did the right thing when everyone around you was laughing because it was the right thing, not because anyone was watching. The rest is just marksmanship. She let a small smile touch her mouth. Yeah, when you're ready, come find me. And then Rachel Carter walked out of the review room past the empty chair where the man who'd buried her had sat out into a morning that belonged to her again. And she did not look back because she had never needed anyone in that room to tell her who she was. She had come back not to be seen and not to be believed and not to be given anything at all. She had come back because when the shooting started and the boys were dying and everyone else called her nothing, someone had to be the one who survived it, and someone had to be the one who made sure the next ones did too. And from that day forward, in that command and every command the story reached, no one ever again made the mistake of looking at Rachel Carter and seeing just a civilian. 10 days later, Rachel Carter walked into the review room without a sling. The stitches were out. The arm still ached and would ache for months, but she'd left the sling in the truck on purpose because she was not going to walk into that room looking like anything a man could pity or dismiss. She wore civilian clothes, plain and clean, and she carried nothing but herself, and she took a seat at the far end of the long table where the witnesses sat, and she waited. Vance found her before the room filled. He came in early in his dress uniform, and he sat down in the empty chair beside her without asking. "You sure about this?" he said quietly. "About what? About sitting there at the end, like you're nobody." He kept his voice low. "Hallstrom offered you a seat up front, witness of record. You turned it down." "Why, Mo? Because I want him comfortable," Rachel said. "Merrick, I want him to walk in and see a contractor at the end of the table and feel exactly the way he felt 3 years ago, that I'm furniture, that I don't matter, that nothing in this room can touch him." Her eyes were fixed on the door. A man who feels safe doesn't guard his mouth. A man who feels watched does. "I've spent 3 years being furniture sergeant. I can do it for 1 more hour if it's the last hour it ever cost me." Vance studied the side of her face. "You've thought about this a long time. I've thought about nothing else for 3 years," Rachel said. "I just didn't have anything to do with the thinking until now." The room filled slowly after that. General Hallstrom took his place at the head of the table, and beside him sat the investigating officers with their folders squared and their pens uncapped. And along one wall sat the soldiers of Blackthorn, 2-6 in their dress uniforms, every one of them who could stand. There was Doyle, scrubbed and nervous, turning his cover over and over in his hands. And there, thinner and paler, but on his own 2 feet, was Tom Harker, who had checked himself out of a hospital bed against the same advice Rachel had ignored 10 days before because he'd said he was not going to lie in a bed, while the woman who saved his life stood up in a room full of officers alone. And near the back in a chair set slightly apart with his own arm still in a sling, sat Lieutenant Kessler, who had asked to attend and been granted it, and who could not seem to make his eyes rest on any single thing. And then the last of them came in, and the whole feel of the room changed. He was a full colonel now, silver eagles bright on his shoulders, and he walked the way men walk when they have spent a career believing the ground bends to them. His name was Colonel Merrick, and 3 years ago he had been the major who told Rachel Carter to stand down and watch people die, and then wrote the report that made it her fault. He hadn't aged so much as hardened, and he moved through the room, shaking hands, murmuring greetings, nodding to the general, playing the part of the senior officer come to lend his weight to a routine review of an unfortunate incident. And he did not recognize Rachel. Why would he? She was a civilian at the end of the table, a contractor, a background figure, exactly the kind of person his eyes had learned long ago to slide across without stopping. His gaze passed over her the way it had passed over her 1,000 times in another life, and moved on, and he took his seat near the head of the table with the easy confidence of a man who believed he was among the judges and not the judged. Rachel watched him sit. She said nothing. She had been saying nothing for 3 years. She could wait a few minutes more. General Hallstrom opened the review. He laid out the facts of the Blackthorn ambush plainly without drama. The training exercise, the loss of communications, the paramilitary cell, the 11 survivors, and then he began to walk the timeline forward. And as he did, he called the witnesses one at a time, and the truth of that day began to build in the room like pressure behind a wall. Vance spoke first. He rose and he did not flinch, and he told them exactly what had happened. The platoon pinned in the open, the wounded bleeding where no one could reach them, the lieutenant frozen against a wall, while his men looked to him for orders that would not come, and then a woman coming down off the eastern ridge alone who had killed the men who were killing them, and who had gotten shot doing it and had picked the rifle back up and done it again. "I've been in this army 16 years, Vance said. "I have never seen anything like it, and I'd be dead if I hadn't. Every man in this room in a Blackthorn uniform would be dead. That's not an exaggeration for effect, General. That is the arithmetic of that day." Doyle spoke next, and his voice cracked twice, and he pushed through it anyway. He told them about the batteries, about the warning at the supply office the day before when the whole platoon was laughing, and a contractor had pulled him aside and told him to pack 2 extra battery packs and keep them warm against his body and not tell anybody. That was the only radio in the whole platoon still working when the shooting started, Doyle said. Every other set was dead in the cold exactly like she said they'd be. If she hadn't told me to pack those batteries, range control never even knows we're in trouble. No bird gets launched. Bobby comes. He looked down at his cover, turning in his hands. She saved us before she ever touched a rifle. She saved us the day before when we were laughing at her. Then Harker rose slow and careful, one hand braced on the table. You should sit, son Hallstrom said gently. With respect, sir, I'll stand for this. Harker steadied himself. I took a round in the gut in that valley. I was going out. I could feel it, that gray, coming in from the edges, and I'd stopped being scared. Which is how, it's bad when you stop being scared. He swallowed. And then there was this woman kneeling over me in the dirt, and she wasn't scared either, but hers was a different kind of not scared than mine. She asked me if I had a girl back home. I told her Emily. And she made me promise I'd sit on a porch someday and tell Emily about the day I got shot in a canyon in Montana, and she made me keep breathing to do it. His voice thickened. I'm going to marry Emily this fall, General. And the only reason there's going to be a wedding is that a contractor everybody called nothing decided I was somebody's whole world and wasn't going to let me quit. And through all of it, Colonel Merrick listened with the polite, faintly impatient expression of a senior officer sitting through testimony that did not concern him, glancing once at his watch, and he still did not understand where he was. Then Kessler stood up. He rose slowly, awkward with the sling, and the room shifted because everyone knew what Kessler had done in that valley, or rather what he had failed to do, and there was a general expectation that a man in his position would shade the truth to save what was left of himself. He didn't. I want to be clear about something, Kessler said, and his voice was tight and unsteady, but it did not stop. The contractor didn't just save us with a rifle. She tried to save us the day before with a warning about the terrain that I dismissed. She tried to save us with a warning about the batteries that I mocked in front of the whole platoon. She read the whole thing before it happened, every piece of it. And I called her sweetheart and told her to sit down and let the men handle the mountain. He forced the words out. When the shooting started, I froze. I want that on the record in my own words, not somebody else's. I froze, and a woman I had treated like she was beneath contempt did the job I was commissioned to do and then bled for it. The investigating officer looked up. Lieutenant, you understand, this testimony reflects very poorly on you. You're under no obligation to characterize your own conduct this harshly. I understand that, sir. Then why are you doing it? Kessler was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his eyes went down the table and found Rachel's and held them and did not look away. Because she didn't lay me out there, he said. I called her nothing, and then I froze, and she still came up that ridge and killed 8 men to save my life, along with everybody else's. She didn't decide I was worth less because I treated her like she was worth less. She just came. His jaw worked. I've got a long list of things to be ashamed of from that day. I'm not going to add lying to it. She saw the battlefield better than I did because she was better than me. And the reason I couldn't see that is the reason none of us could. She wasn't wearing a uniform, so we decided she was empty. And she wasn't. She was the most dangerous person on that mountain, and she was on our side, and we spat on her right up until the second she saved our lives. He sat back down. The room was very quiet, and it was General Hallstrom who turned then slowly, deliberately to Colonel Merrick and said, Colonel, you've reviewed a great many after-action reports over your career. You've got something of a reputation for it. I'd value your professional assessment when a subordinate provides an accurate warning of a compromise and command overrules that warning and casualties result. Where does the accountability lie? Merrick smiled, comfortable in his element. This was the ground he understood. That's a complex question, General. Command has to weigh many sources of intelligence. A single voice, especially one outside the formal chain, can't be permitted to override a validated operational plan. Sometimes a warning turns out to be correct in hindsight, but command can't operate on hindsight. In my experience, the accountability in these cases lies with the failure of the intelligence picture as a whole, not with any single decision, and certainly not with any single commander. So the person who gave the correct warning bears no fault, Hallstrom said. Of course not. And the commander who overruled the correct warning bears no fault either because he couldn't have known in advance the warning was right. Precisely, sir. It's the system that fails in these cases, not the individuals inside it. Hallstrom nodded slowly as though turning it over with real respect. That's interesting, Colonel, because that is almost word for word what you wrote 3 years ago in a different after-action report about a different compromise movement. The smallest flicker crossed Merrick's face. Just a flicker there and gone. I've written many reports, General. You have. Hallstrom opened the folder in front of him without hurry. Let me refresh your memory on this particular one. 3 years ago, a counter-sniper element was tasked to protect a diplomatic movement. One member of that element assessed the route as compromised. She warned that the schedule had been leaked. She warned that they were walking a soft target into a kill zone and that the leak had to be internal because the enemy knew things the enemy shouldn't have known. Hallstrom's voice never rose, and somehow that made every word land harder. That member was ordered to stand down by her commanding officer. The movement proceeded. It went into the kill zone exactly the way she said it would. People died. And afterward, the after-action report determined that the fault lay with, and I am quoting you now, the failure of the intelligence picture as a whole, not with the command decision to overrule the warning, and certainly not with the commanding officer who gave the order to stand down. He looked up. Do you happen to remember who that commanding officer was, Colonel Merrick? The room had gone absolutely still, and Merrick for the first time turned his head and looked down the length of the table at the civilian woman he'd walked past on his way in, and Rachel Carter looked straight back at him, and she watched the recognition arrive on his face the way a slow tide comes up a beach unhurried, and then all at once, and she did not smile, and she did not look away. You, Rachel said quietly into the silence. The commanding officer was you. Merrick's mouth opened. General, I don't. You told me to stand down. Rachel rose from her chair slowly, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not need to because the room had gone so quiet that a whisper would have carried to the walls. You told me a contractor, a woman, a shooter, wasn't cleared to make that assessment. You told me my job was to pull a trigger and not to think. And I followed your order, Colonel. I stood down, and I watched people I had sworn to protect die through an optic I was not allowed to fire. Because you told me to. You are out of line, Merrick said, but something had gone out of his voice. And then you wrote the report. She came around the end of the table, unhurried, relentless, the way she did everything that mattered. You turned a leak into my fault. You ended my career to protect the chain of command, which meant to protect yourself. You called it a medical discharge, and you buried me in a supply office at the edge of nowhere, and you moved on, and you got promoted twice, and you never thought about me again. Did you? Merrick said nothing. You didn't, Rachel answered for him. Because to you I was never a person. I was a loose end you tied off. But here's the part I didn't understand until 10 days ago, Colonel. You had a reason to bury it that ran deeper than protecting the chain of command. Because the leak that killed those people 3 years ago wasn't a failure of the intelligence picture as a whole. It was one man. It was internal. I said so at the time, and you told me to be silent. And I've wondered ever since why you were so desperate to make me the story instead of finding the leak. Her voice dropped, and it was colder now and steadier. And now I know. You didn't find the leak because you were the leak. You sold that movement. And when the one person on your team read the ground and called it out loud, you couldn't afford to let that warning stand because an honest investigation into an internal leak might have walked right up to your desk. So you gave me an order to be silent. And then you made me the villain so no one would ever look past me to you. This is a fantasy, Merrick snapped. And he was on his feet now too, and his composure was cracking at the edges. General, this woman is a discharged contractor with a grievance 3 years old. She has no evidence, no standing, and no— Sit down, Colonel Hallstrom said. General, I have every right to sit down. And into that exact moment, the door at the back of the room opened. Agent Bauer walked in unhurried in the same lean gray suit, and behind him came 2 federal agents, and behind them came a third man in handcuffs, and Merrick's face went the color of old paper the instant he saw him, because he knew him. Everyone who had followed the Blackthorn investigation knew him now. It was Lieutenant Colonel Prater. Colonel Merrick Bauer said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, the gentleness of a man who has been waiting a very long time and can finally afford to be calm. I believe you're acquainted with Lieutenant Colonel Prater. He's been remarkably talkative these past 10 days. It turns out a man staring down conspiracy charges and the attempted murder of a federal prisoner becomes very interested in explaining exactly who was giving him his orders. The gentleness fell away about the movement schedules you sold, about the cell you fed, about Blackthorn. And once we knew to ask the right questions about a diplomatic movement 3 years ago that was your very first sale and the one you were most afraid of being caught for, which is precisely why you needed a scapegoat badly enough to destroy one of the finest counter-snipers this country has ever trained. Merrick stood frozen at the head of the table, and Rachel watched the careful architecture of 3 years fall down in his face one piece at a time, and she waited to feel the things she'd imagined feeling for 3 years, the triumph, the vindication, the sweetness of it. And it did not come. What came instead was quieter and heavier and far more complete. It was the feeling of the truth finally standing up in a room where no one could seal it away again. And standing up not because she'd shouted it, but because she'd waited in silence for the exact moment it could do the most damage. And the moment had come, and the truth was on its feet, and it was not going to sit back down. "You want to know the part that took me the longest to make peace with?" Rachel said. And now she was looking only at Merrick, and her voice was almost soft. "It isn't that you sold those people. Men sell people. It's ugly and it's old and the world is full of it. It's that when I stood in front of you and read the ground correctly, when I did the one thing I was trained to do better than almost anyone alive, you looked at me and you decided the safest thing to do with a person that good was to break her. Not because I was wrong, because I was right. Being right in front of you was the most dangerous thing I ever did." She let that sit, and I let it break me for 3 years. That's the part that was mine. I let you make me believe that being right didn't count if the wrong person heard it. And then a boy named Doyle asked me about a battery manifest, and I remembered that being right always counts. It just doesn't always get to count in time. Bauer stepped forward. "Colonel Merrick, you're under arrest for espionage, conspiracy, and murder." They took him out in handcuffs, and he walked past the soldiers of Blackthorn 2-6, past General Hallstrom, past the empty end of the table where the woman he'd buried had been sitting when he came in, and he did not look at a single one of them, and the door closed behind him, and the whole room let out a breath it had been holding for the length of a career. For a moment, no one spoke. Then General Hallstrom closed his folder, and he looked down the table at Rachel, and when he spoke, his voice had lost the cool procedural evenness he'd used to trap Merrick and gained something rougher and more human. "The record of your discharge is going to be corrected," he said, "fully, formally, on paper that cannot be sealed, that cannot be revitalized, that cannot be quietly walked back the way these things always seem to get walked back. The finding of fault against you 3 years ago is vacated as of this morning. The truth replaces it. And every officer in that chain who signed off on burying you is going to answer for what they signed." He paused. "I know that doesn't return the 3 years. I know there is no version of me sitting here that can hand you back what he took. But it's yours, all of it, and it's on the record, and it's permanent. That's a promise Miss Carter and I don't make many." "I believe you, General," Churchill said. "There's more." Hallstrom leaned forward, and his eyes were steady on her. "The Army wants to offer you a return to service. Full reinstatement. Restored rank, seniority, back pay for the whole 3 years. Your career whole again, as though none of it had happened. Everything they took given back." He watched her carefully. "You'd be one of us again." And the room waited, because this was the ending. Every one of them had assumed they were building toward the exile ended, the uniform returned, the wrong made right, in the only currency the institution really understood. Vance leaned forward slightly. Doyle stopped turning his cover in his hands. Rachel was quiet for a long moment. She looked around the room. At Vance, who had trusted her with the lives of his men, in the 1 second it counted before he knew a single thing about her. At Doyle, who had packed the batteries when everyone was laughing. At Harker, alive because of a girl named Emily. At Kessler, who had told the truth in a room where a lie would have been kinder to himself. And she looked down at her own hands, the ones that had held a rifle on a ridge with one arm dead and her body going into shock. The same hands that had counted crates for 3 years, because it was the only way she'd found to stay near the thing she loved without being allowed to be it. "No," she said. The surprise moved through the room like a draft. "Ma'am," Vance said before he could stop himself. "I appreciate it, General. I mean that." Rachel's voice was calm and clear. "But I didn't come back for the uniform. I didn't come back for reinstatement or rank or back pay or any of it." She glanced once at the empty chair where Merrick had sat. "And I didn't come back for validation. I already knew I was right. I have always known I was right. Having it on paper is a kindness, and I'll take it, and I'll be grateful for it, but it was never the thing I needed. Because the thing I needed I already had. I just forgot I had it for a while." "Then why?" Hallstrom asked quietly. "Why come back at all? Why walk out of a hospital against medical advice to hunt a colonel? Why put a rifle back in your hands after 3 years, if not to get your life back? Because someone had to survive, Rachel said simply. A boy named Doyle asked me about a battery manifest, and a lieutenant called me sweetheart. And by 9 o'clock the next morning, every one of them was going to die in a canyon. I'd already warned them about exactly the way it happened the first time. Command ignores the warning. The soft target walks into the kill zone. People I could have helped die in front of me because someone decided my judgment didn't count. Same as before. Identical. She looked at the soldiers along the wall. Only this time, nobody could give me an order to stand down. This time, I was just a civilian. And it turns out that just a civilian is the freest thing a person can be because no one on earth can order a civilian to watch people die. So I didn't. That's the whole reason. That's all of it. Hallstrom studied her. Then what will you do if not this? A talent like yours doesn't belong in a supply office, and we both know it. And Rachel Carter smiled, and this time it was warm, because she had known the answer to that question since the moment she came down off that ridge and found young Doyle with his hands red and his eyes full of a terror no 19-year-old should ever have to carry. There are people out there who read the ground the way I do, she said. Young ones, the ones who see it coming before anyone else and don't have the words for it yet, or the rank, or anyone in the room willing to listen to them. 3 years ago, I was one of them. And instead of using what I could do, the system decided it was safer to break me for it. I am not the only one that's happened to. I won't be the last. She looked around the table. I'm not going back into the fight, General. I don't need to pull the trigger anymore. But I'll teach. I'll take the ones everyone underestimates, the ones who get called just a civilian or just a woman or just some kid who files paperwork, and I will teach them every single thing I know. So that the next time somebody reads the ground and calls a compromise, there's a whole generation trained to recognize the sound of the truth and stand behind the person saying it instead of burying them for the crime of being right too early. The room was silent. That's a better use of what I am, Rachel said, than putting the uniform back on and pulling another trigger. I don't need to be the one on the rifle anymore. I need to make sure the right people are holding it when it matters and the right people are standing behind them when they make the call. That's the thing I came back for. I just didn't have the words for it until right now. General Hallstrom looked at her for a long moment, and then he stood. And every soldier in that room stood with him. And Sergeant Vance, 16 years in the United States Army, the man who had once found her crouched at a fracture line and called her lost, who had told her she was on a nature walk in a restricted zone, came to attention and rendered Rachel Carter a salute. And one by one, every soldier of Blackthorn 2-6 did the same, Doyle and Harker and all the rest. And last of all, Lieutenant Kessler rose with his arm in its sling and lifted his good hand to his brow and held it there, saluting the woman he had once called sweetheart. It was the only salute any of them would ever render to a person in civilian clothes. And every one of them meant it more than any salute they had ever given to anyone in their lives. Rachel didn't salute back. She wasn't a soldier anymore. And somewhere in the last 10 days, she had made her peace with that real peace, the kind that doesn't come from getting your career restored, but from finally understanding what you're for. She just nodded once to all of them, and she turned toward the door. Doyle's voice stopped her. Ma'am, he said, and everyone heard the crack in it, when you start teaching. Those people you're going to train. He swallowed hard. Is there any chance a guy like me could learn from you someday? Somebody who almost didn't get it. But who packed the batteries anyway? Rachel looked back at him, at the hopeful, earnest face that had not been tested when she first met him, and had been tested nearly to breaking since, and had held. Doyle, she said, you already learned the only thing I can't teach anybody. You did the right thing when every single person around you was laughing, because it was the right thing, and not because anybody was watching. That's the part that can't be taught. Either a person has it or they don't, and you have it. A small smile touched the corner of her mouth. The rest is just marksmanship. In marksmanship, I can teach. She held his eyes. When you're ready, come find me. I'll be waiting. And then Rachel Carter walked out of the review room, past the empty chair, where the man who had buried her had sat and would never sit again, out into a morning that belonged to her once more. She did not look back. She had never once needed anyone in that room to tell her who she was. She had not come back to be seen, and she had not come back to be believed, and she had not come back to be given a single thing. She had come back because when the shooting started and the boys were dying, and everyone else looked at her and saw nothing. Someone had to be the one who survived, and someone had to make certain the next ones did too. She had been right 3 years ago, and she had been right 10 days ago, and she would go on being right for the rest of her life, only now she would spend that life making sure the world learned to listen the first time. And from that day forward, in that command and in every command, the story reached, and it reached them all. No one ever again looked at Rachel Carter and made the mistake of seeing just a civilian.